Before we say or do anything else today, I want to pause to extend our thoughts and our prayers for the well-being of Whip Scalise and our colleagues, police and staff who were attacked by a gunman this morning in Virginia. Several members of this committee were there. This is a sad day for our country. We still don't have all the details, but we do know that there are those who want to use acts of violence to create chaos, to disrupt our democracy. The American people will not let them win. So after deliberation with the ranking member, we have decided to proceed. The Secretary has a very challenging schedule. Given these circumstances and the delayed start of our hearing, I want to appeal to members to attempt to use less than their full 5 minutes so that more of our colleagues have a chance to participate. And I will be abbreviating my opening statement. Today, Secretary Tillerson will testify on the administration's budget and reorganization plans for the Department of State. First off, Mr. Secretary, let me welcome you to this committee. This committee and your department manage an essential responsibility for our government set at its founding, and that is defending our nation. The committee strives to be bipartisan. We are fortunate to have a ranking member, Mr. Engel, who shares this approach. We look forward to working with you, Mr. Secretary. We wish you success in your tenure. For generations, America has been the leader of the world. This has required great sacrifice. But our commitment to stability, to the rule of law, to open markets and human rights, and our work through alliances have all paid off greatly. We have made mistakes, no doubt, sometimes by overreaching in our commitments and sometimes by not reaching at all. But our nation has certainly been a force for good. If we do not lead in security and commerce as well, and in values and in ideas, the vacuum will be filled by others, including jihadists and others wishing us grave harm. Leading takes resources. Sufficient resources are needed for our military for sure, but also for our diplomats working to end the many conflicts impacting our security. That's what the generals say. In today's well-connected age in which threats can come from anywhere, we need a very broad diplomatic presence, and that takes resources too, especially to keep our diplomats safe. Resources are also needed to support our humanitarian relief and to support development. Their work abroad benefits America at home. Consider that a modest emergency investment in West Africa's health stopped cold what looked like an emerging Ebola panic in our country a few years ago. Mr. Secretary, I'm confident that you will find new efficiencies in your department. There is waste to attack, but many here remain concerned by the hand you were dealt with in the budget and look forward to strengthening it. Congress also has a responsibility not to hamstring the department with mandates and with restrictions, and these have accumulated over years, compounding your management challenges. For our partnership to succeed, we need to communicate often. Too often, administrations go it alone, as frankly the last administration did. Iran and Cuba policy are examples. Let's break that pattern. And I will now turn to Mr. Engel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I know that the shooting in Alexandria this morning is all on our minds. It's shocking. We're all hoping for the best for our colleague Steve Scalise, the police officers, and others who are victims of the attack. We wish them a speedy recovery, and we're thinking of their loved ones this morning. Mr. Secretary, we're glad to have you here. I wish you well, but I have to tell you that I'm deeply skeptical about this budget, which in my view is part of a foreign policy strategy that would cripple American diplomacy and development efforts around the world. This strategy has been carried out first and foremost through inaction, with an initial purge that pushed out some of our most senior and accomplished career diplomats. This administration has eliminated years of expertise and experience in one fell swoop. And with few exceptions, the President simply has not nominated anyone to help you run the department. Mr. Chairman, I ask that my graphic be displayed. This is an organizational chart of the State Department. The three dark green boxes are President Trump's confirmed nominees. Light green boxes are officials in place from the last administration. Yellow boxes are nominees awaiting Senate action. And all the red boxes are positions for which the President hasn't even submitted a nomination. That's a lot of red boxes, far behind where Presidents Bush and Obama were at this point, and that doesn't cover the dozen of vacant ambassadorships. We should all keep this in mind next time there is talk about obstruction in Congress. People have not been confirmed, not because there's obstruction, because they haven't been submitted. Now, career diplomats keeping the seats warm are capable and devoted public servants, but they aren't able to direct our foreign policy. What is the President's approach to Russia's hacking our election, or nonproliferation, or human trafficking, or Africa, or the Arctic? When will we have the undersecretaries and assistant secretaries and ambassadors at large to put these policies in place? The second indication of the administration's view of the State Department is this document. This is the budget, the 2018 State Department budget, submitted to Congress by the Secretary of State. It calls for 32% cut to our international affairs budget. I have never seen a budget proposal so reckless in all the years I've been here, so insulting to our personnel, and so quick to hit bipartisan opposition. Mr. Secretary, when we spoke, you told me that you hope to put the State Department on a glide path to reduce spending levels. A one-third cut is more like a nosedive. Imagine being an American diplomat, learning that this is the value the administration places on your service. Imagine waking up every morning in a dangerous place on the other side of the world, knowing that the officials responsible for your safety haven't even been nominated, and that America's top diplomat, which is you, Mr. Secretary, was coming here to tell us, ask us for a 32% budget cut. Some consequences of this budget will hit us down the road. If we fail to invest in diplomacy and development now, the conflicts we don't prevent will come back to us as the wars we'll need to fight. Senator Lindsey Graham said it well, and I quote him, "If we implemented this budget, we'd have to retreat from the world and put a lot of people at risk," unquote. He said we would have, quote, "a lot of Benghazis in the making if we actually implemented the State Department cuts," unquote. He's right. The budget cuts embassy security by more than $1 billion, 62%. Embassy security cut 62%. So fortunately, on this point, Congress retains the power of the purse, so we'll have the last word on this issue. So I think that we need a lot of clarity on this, and I think this committee should keep pressing these issues until we have the answers you need. I'm going to stop now, Mr. Chairman, because we've agreed to shorten our statement, but I'll submit the rest of my statement for the record.
Thank you very much, Mr. Engel. This morning, we're pleased to be joined by Mr. Rex Tillerson. He is the 69th Secretary of State. Prior to his appointment, the Secretary spent 40 years at ExxonMobil, culminating as the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer. Secretary Tillerson also has long been involved with the Boy Scouts of America, most recently serving as the Boy Scouts National President. Mr. Secretary, welcome to our committee. Without objection, the witness's full prepared statement will be made part of the record. Members are going to have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or any questions they might have of the Secretary or any extraneous material for the record. Also, we want as many members as possible to have a chance to question the Secretary. So to accomplish that, I just ask that everyone respect the time limit, and that means leaving an adequate amount of time for the Secretary to answer your questions. Nothing requires full use of your time, and we will begin with Secretary Tillerson's testimony.
Well, thank you, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, distinguished members of the committee. Of course, we were all stunned by the news of the shooting involving your colleague, members of congressional staff, and Capitol Police. Congressman Scalise is a friend of mine. He's a friend and represents many friends of mine back in Louisiana. My prayers and those of my colleagues at the State Department are with the injured and with those members of law enforcement who responded to this morning's attack. Today, I'd like to continue the conversation that we have started about the administration's State Department and USAID budget request for fiscal year 2018. Before I begin my testimony on the budget, I'd like to offer a point of view on the Russian sanctions legislation currently being considered by the Congress. I certainly agree with the sentiment that has been conveyed by several members from both parties that Russia must be held accountable for its meddling in U.S. elections. I would urge Congress to ensure any legislation allows the President to have the flexibility to adjust sanctions to meet the needs of what is always an evolving diplomatic situation. Essentially, we would ask for the flexibility to turn the heat up when we need to, but also to ensure that we have the ability to maintain a constructive dialogue. As we all know, America's global competitive advantages and standing as a leader are under constant challenge. The dedicated men and women of the State Department and USAID carry out the important and often perilous work of advancing America's interest every single day. That mission is unchanged. However, the State Department and USAID, like many other institutions here and around the world, have not evolved in their responsiveness as quickly as new challenges and threats to our national security have changed and are changing. We are challenged to respond to a post-Cold War world that set in motion new global dynamics and a post-9/11 world characterized by historic new threats that present themselves in ways never seen before, enabled by technological tools that we have been ill-prepared to engage. The 21st century has already presented many evolving challenges to U.S. national security and economic prosperity. We must develop proactive responses to protect and advance the interest of the American people. With such a broad array of threats facing the United States, the fiscal year 2018 budget request of $37.6 billion aligns with the administration's objective of making America's security our top priority. The first responsibility of government is the security of its own citizens, and we will orient our diplomatic efforts toward fulfilling that commitment. While our mission will also be focused on advancing the economic interests of the American people, the State Department's primary focus will be to protect our citizens at home and abroad. Our mission is at all times guided by our longstanding values of freedom, democracy, individual liberty, and human dignity. The conviction of our country's founders is enduring, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. As a nation, we hold high the aspiration that all will one day experience the freedom we have known. In our young administration's foreign policy, we are motivated by the conviction that the more we engage with other nations on issues of security and prosperity, the more we will have opportunities to shape the human rights conditions in those nations. History has shown that the United States leaves a footprint of freedom wherever it goes. Ensuring the security and prosperity of the American people and advancing our values has necessitated difficult decisions in other areas of our budget. The fiscal year 2018 budget request includes substantial funding for many foreign assistance programs under the auspices of USAID and the State Department, but we have made hard choices to reduce funding for other initiatives. Even with reductions in funding, we will continue to be the leader in international development, global health, democracy and good governance initiatives, and humanitarian efforts. If natural disasters or epidemics strike overseas, America will respond with care and support. I am convinced we can maximize the effectiveness of the programs and continue to offer America's helping hand to the world. This budget request also reflects a commitment to ensure every tax dollar spent is aligned with the Department and USAID's mission-critical objectives. The request focuses the State Department and USAID efforts on missions which deliver the greatest value and opportunity of success for the American people. The State Department and USAID budget increased over 60% from fiscal year 2007, reaching a record high $55.6 billion in fiscal year 2017. Recognizing that this rate of increase in funding is not sustainable, the fiscal year 2018 budget request seeks to align the core missions of the State Department with historic funding levels. We believe this budget also represents the interest of the American people, including responsible stewardship of the public's money. I know there is intense interest in prospective State Department and USAID redesign efforts. We've just completed collecting information on our organizational processes and culture through a survey that was made available to every one of our state and USAID colleagues. Over 35,000 surveys were completed, and we have held in-person listening sessions with approximately 300 individuals to obtain their perspective on what we do and how we do it. I met personally with dozens of team members who spoke candidly about their experiences. From this feedback, we have been able to get a clear overall view of our organization. We have no preconceived outcomes, and our discussions of the goals, priorities, and directions of the State Department and USAID are not token exercises. The principles for our listening sessions and subsequent evaluation of our organization are the same as those which I stated in my confirmation hearing for our foreign policy. We will see the world for what it is, be honest with ourselves and the American people, follow the facts where they lead us, and hold ourselves and others accountable. We are still analyzing the feedback we have received, and we expect to release the findings of the survey soon. From all of this, one thing is certain. I'm listening to what my people are telling me are the challenges facing them and how we can produce a more efficient and effective State Department and USAID. And we'll work as a team with the Congress to improve both organizations. Throughout my career, I have never believed, nor have I ever experienced, that the level of funding devoted to a goal is the most important factor in achieving it. Our budget will never determine our ability to be effective. Our people will. My colleagues at the State Department and USAID are a deep source of inspiration, and their patriotism, professionalism, and willingness to make sacrifices for our country are our greatest resource. I'm confident that the U.S. State Department and USAID will continue to deliver results for the American people. I thank you for the time and am happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. This committee has worked to make the State Department more efficient in December, and as you know, the first state authorities bill in over a decade was signed into law. So that was our work product. We stand ready to work with you to reform the department. And on reorganization on this question, I just ask that you commit to intensified consultation between your staff and the committee in terms of plans for reform.
We certainly will do that and welcome and seek your input as
Thank
we go
you.
about this.
I only have one question, and it goes to the issue of North Korea, Secretary Tillerson. You know, this situation, we were encouraged yesterday first to hear news that Otto Warmbier would be returned to the United States, but then we found out about his condition. We were horrified to learn that he was in a coma. This is outrageous. And on Monday, we heard Secretary Mattis call North Korea the top security threat to the United States. And you've been working a strategy, I know, to ratchet pressure on the regime. Last Congress, we passed and signed into law a comprehensive North Korea sanctions bill to go after those assisting the regime. And then recently we passed out of this committee again another piece of legislation, this one to attack North Korea's use of overseas labor, indentured servitude, in which the check goes to the regime and they use it for hard currency and they can use it for their nuclear weapons program. We heard kind of mixed reports on China's cooperation on this. And there's a new report out this week, and it shows that by cracking down on a relatively small number of interlinked Chinese companies that deal with North Korea, we could really crank things up. And reportedly, the administration has asked China to act on some 10 entities. If Beijing doesn't act, are we prepared, with the sanctions we've put on the books now, to act unilaterally with third-party sanctions in order to cut off the hard currency? This is a very expensive program they're running. It costs them billions and billions of dollars a year, and frankly, they don't make much of anything. So they need the hard currency coming in order to fund this program, and this is what I wanted to ask you.
Thank you, Chairman. I am familiar with the report you're referencing. Treasury Department also has that report, and will examine the study that was done and the results they found. The approach we are taking with North Korea, as you're aware, is one of eliciting countries all over the world to support us in putting pressure on the regime in Pyongyang to change and alter their position and their view before we are willing to sit down and conduct discussions with them. Clearly, China is the capstone to achieving this kind of pressure. This was a topic of significant discussion in President Xi and President Trump's summit in Mar-a-Lago. The communications have been very clear. Our expectations have been very clear with the Chinese. Their cooperation, I would say, has been notable, but it has been uneven. And we continue that dialogue with the Chinese, specifically around their actions that support revenue streams to North Korea, but also taking action against entities inside of China that may be supporting revenue streams as well. We will be having another high-level dialogue next week when Secretary Mattis and myself meet with our counterparts here in Washington. That will be one of the first topics on the agenda. We have made it clear to them, and we have provided them a list of entities that we believe they need to take action against. We have asked that they take the action, but President Trump's also been very clear with President Xi that if they either don't want to take the action or they do not take the action, we will act on our own.
I concur. We can't have dialogue forever, Mr. Secretary, and so thank you, and I go to Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I just want to say that I heard what you said, but I don't find it compelling that we can operate the State Department and diplomacy with a 33% cut or one-third cut. It just seems to me like it's, you know, I know you'll do the best with what you have, obviously, but I just think it's showing where priorities are not, and priorities don't seem to be with State Department, with diplomacy. I just want to say that. Because we're short in time, Mr. Secretary, I'd like to start by getting you to respond to a series of questions, but I'd like just a yes or a no if you can. As you may know, and we chatted a little bit before, this committee under Chairman Royce and myself has a longstanding bipartisan tradition, and we've worked closely with both Republican and Democratic administrations. So I was taken aback by, apparently, the Trump administration's apparent decision to ignore oversight requests of Democratic members of Congress. In a letter to the President, Senator Grassley called the administration's departure from longstanding practice nonsense, and I was pleased that Homeland Secretary Kelly, Homeland Security Secretary Kelly, rejected this guidance by saying, and I quote him, "Regardless of who the letter comes from, and it doesn't have to just come from a ranking member or chairman, we'll respond to any congressional inquiry." That's a quote from him. So I'd like to ask you, Mr. Secretary, will you join Secretary Kelly in committing to respond to congressional inquiries and information requests, regardless of the political party of the member inquiring?
I already have, and I will.
Thank you. Can I have your commitment that you will direct the Department to respond to requests for information made by the committee staff as the designees of the chairman and ranking member?
I think, indeed, through the appropriate channels and processes.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, a member of your staff informed my staff that the reorganization you're planning for the State Department will require statutory changes. So I'm glad to know that that's the State Department's position, because I agree with that. When your reorganization assessment is complete, will you commit to coming to this committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, which is oversight and authorizing responsibilities for the State Department, with any requests you have for organizational changes at the department?
Yes, and we would expect to work with you on that as we're developing those.
Okay, thank you. It was recently reported that within the first few weeks of the administration, top White House aides attempted unsuccessfully to lift economic sanctions imposed on Russia in response to the illegal occupation of Crimea and interference in the 2016 presidential election. This followed repeated contacts with the Russians by Jared Kushner, Michael Flynn, Jeff Sessions, and others. So do you accept the conclusion, Mr. Secretary, of the Intelligence Committee that Russia criminally interfered in last year's election?
Yes, I do, and I have no knowledge of any of those efforts that you mentioned.
Okay. Do you believe that it is in the U.S. interest to relax sanctions on Russia before she has fully complied with the Minsk framework and left Crimea?
I think it is important that we be given sufficient flexibility to achieve the Minsk objectives. It is very possible that the government of Ukraine and the government of Russia could come to a satisfactory resolution through some structure other than Minsk, but would achieve the objectives of Minsk, which we're committed to. So my caution is I wouldn't want to have ourselves handcuffed to Minsk if it turns out the parties decide to settle this through a different agreement.
Well, let me say that I hear what you're saying, but I disagree, because I believe that the only thing that Russia understands is tough talk. And if they think that we're somehow willing to relax the sanctions on them before they've complied with the Minsk framework and left Crimea, I think it just will encourage Putin to continue his bullying, and who knows where he'll strike next.
That is not our intent, nor will we do that. I'm back to the objectives of Minsk.
Okay, and let me finally ask you, what has the administration done to respond to the Russian assault on our presidential election? Have you spoken with the President about how to prevent it from ever happening again?
I've spoken to the Russians directly about it. Their response is pretty much as you've seen their response publicly to be. But we have registered our complaint about that, and that it is going to be a constant obstacle to our ability to improve our relationship if they do not address it.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you,
my
Mr.
3
Engel. We
seconds.
go now to Congresswoman Eliana Ross-Layton of Florida.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. I'm strongly against the proposed zeroing out of democracy and governance programs, especially in Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, where civil society is facing increasing repression. In the last 2 months, nearly 3,000 Venezuelans have been jailed, over 1,000 have been injured, and nearly 70 people have been killed by Maduro's thugs. So I ask you to please place more human rights violators on our sanctions list. On a separate topic, in January of this year, your State Department determined that the PLO and the Palestinian Authority have not complied with their commitments under U.S. law, yet all potential sanctions were waived. And I ask how you can justify an increase when so many things in the budget are cut, but the PA has an increase in your budget request. Also, a few days ago, Mr. Secretary, Israel's Prime Minister called for UNRWA to be folded into the UN Commissioner for Refugees after a Hamas tunnel was found beneath 2 UNRWA schools. Is the U.S. going to support our ally Israel and prohibit funding to UNRWA? And finally, on Iran, as a witness told this committee at a hearing in February, sir, the International Atomic Energy Agency, quote, has not been able to state that Iran has addressed its concerns and questions about past nuclear weapons activities, end quote, and it also, quote, has not stated that it successfully is verifying the JCPOA's prohibitions on specific nuclear weapons development activities, end quote. So considering this lack of verification, how does the Justice Department justify its certification that Iran is in compliance with the JCPOA as it did in April? And I don't want to take more time, but if you could answer adding names to the Venezuela sanctions list, UNRWA funding, or Iran in noncompliance?
We are working with Treasury to develop a very robust list of individuals, and most recently you saw sanctions imposed on 6 members of the Venezuelan Supreme Court in response to their decision handed down, which we felt was certainly not in keeping with the Constitution. We're going to continue to be very engaged in the situation in Venezuela, but as you know, the challenge for the U.S. is to do this in a way that is productive and constructive, as opposed to the U.S. then being used by the Maduro regime as a tool to justify their actions. But rest assured, we have active efforts underway working with others in the OAS in particular. With regard to the Iran compliance, we rely upon the process called for under the JCPOA and the IAEA. We do question them vigorously, and we're in discussions with them to ensure that are they meeting all of those obligations to certify compliance to us. We are reliant upon them to make the certifications to us in order to then make decisions around filing the compliance report and then filing the sanctions waivers that follow on with that. So with respect to the Palestinians, we're in active discussion with the Palestinian Authority. As you know, we had a meeting here in Washington at president level, and I had my own bilateral meetings with President Abbas. We were recently in Israel, had meetings with the authority in Bethlehem. These discussions are around issues of how they manage terrorism and how they manage violence within the West Bank and Gaza, but it's also hopefully setting the stage for a re-engagement on a peace process with the Israelis. So all of those issues of concern have been discussed with them.
Thank you, sir, and I won't take up any more time. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Our hearts go out to the victims. This is an attack on our democracy, and the best response is for us to be here doing our job. So I thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Most of my questions will be for the record because we want to be as brief as possible. It's discussion about what resources the State Department should have. Without objection, I'd like to put into the record a letter from 123 and 4-star flag officers urging that you have more resources than you're asking for. And of course, Senator Corker made similar comments to you yesterday. We in Congress decide how much money is going to be spent. We've got the overall view. We might plug a tax loophole or have savings in another part of the budget that would allow us to spend more on foreign ops. But we do our best job when we get guidance. I would hope that you would submit for the record how you'd spend a 10%, 20%, or 30% increment, what your recommendation to us is if we can find the money to provide that. And I thank you for nodding. I'm going to move on to the red boxes that the ranking member brought up. The undersecretaries, the assistant secretaries that haven't been appointed. We talked about this, and I commend you for your decision to praise the people who are filling these positions as acting assistant secretaries, acting undersecretaries. They are career professionals. They're doing a spectacular job, except they can't do the job because they're temporary. They're not authorized to make policy, and there are hundreds of decisions that shouldn't reach your desk, but need to be made by someone who isn't just there holding down the. So I would urge you to submit a list of those actings that you would recommend keep their job because they're doing a spectacular job, and they've already got their security clearances, and then you hit the ground running, and whoever holds that position not only has the incredible competence that you and I have discussed, but also has the authority of saying, this is really my desk. I would urge you to designate the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps as a specially designated foreign terrorist organization. The Quds Force is already so designated. If you designate the subsidiary, you should designate the entire consolidated group of corporations. That's, if we apply that business term to this situation, you should certainly designate the IRGC, given the thousands of people they've killed in Syria. We face an ideological threat from radical Islamic terrorism. I hope that we would pay to print and provide textbooks to parents who otherwise have to pay them, and expand our broadcasting, particularly in the regional language of Pakistan, especially Sindhi. Now a couple of oral questions. I think this is an easy one. Is the Trump administration committed to the implementation of last year's extension of the U.S.-Israel Memorandum of Understanding regarding security assistance?
Yes.
Another one might be a little tough. They're talking about a arms package for Saudi Arabia starting at $110 billion, perhaps $350 billion over the next 10 years. Can you provide the committee with an assurance that the State Department will closely scrutinize any proposed sales to ensure that they do not adversely impact Israel's qualitative military edge, and that you would oppose the transfer of F-35 aircraft?
We will ensure that all of those sales meet all of our obligations, both to Israel and to others.
I yield back.
I would like to respond.
I yield to the Secretary first.
Yeah, I would like to respond to the ranking member's chart, all the red boxes, since you brought it up. First, just so you know, we have named and have names in the process at the White House for about 50% of the undersecretary, assistant secretary positions, and we have candidate list that we're narrowing down for the remainder. Same on the ambassadorial roles. We have 212 ambassador or representative positions. Over 140 of those are filled. Of the remaining 70, more than about half have already been named and are in process. The other half, we have evaluations with candidates underway. One of the real obstacles over in the process, as I followed up with people, is because a lot of these people were named literally months ago, is what's the holdup? And when we call them, we find out it's getting their paperwork done. Now, the paperwork burden to get the clearance and to satisfy the Office of Ethics, which is important, is extraordinarily burdensome. I know from my own experience, I had to hire 8 individuals to help me get mine done such that I could get it done as quickly as I did. Most people can't afford to do that. And so this is an extraordinary chore for people to get through the paperwork. Even former senators who are been nominated for positions are struggling to get through the paperwork. So just a point that it's not because people haven't been named and they're not in the process. They are being processed.
I yield back.
We go now to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome to the committee, and thank you for your leadership. On human trafficking, Mr. Secretary, the TIP report, as we all know, the country ratings will soon be released. They're under active review right now. Tragically, the Obama administration, in the last 2 years, ignored TIP recommendations and artificially inflated, gave passing grades to countries like China, Cuba, Oman, Malaysia, who have egregious records when it comes to human trafficking. They ignored the TIP professionals, and they politicized the outcome. Reuters confirmed this. They did an investigative report that was incisive and brilliant. I held several hearings on it. The last one was next time get it right, because they didn't. And we sell out the victims of human trafficking when we misappropriate a tierage, Tier 3 being the worst, and say, you're okay when they're not. So please assure the committee that this year's TIP report will be honest, transparent, and will follow wherever the human rights abuse goes. What you do with sanctions, the part 2 of all of that, is all up to you. Hopefully, very informed, and you'll make a great decision on that. But at least get the TIP report right. We got to restore the integrity of that report. Secondly, on food aid, on October 15th, I held a hearing on why everyone, it seemed, were exiting the Middle East and going to Europe. Some wanted to come here, but most flooded into Europe. We were told by the High Commissioner for UNHCR's regional representative that the trigger was the 30% cut in the World Food Program provisions, and that the UNHCR appeals have been so under-realized, average 40%, 60% unrealized, so people felt helpless and abandoned in those refugee camps. They finally said, we're out of here. We're going somewhere, Germany, wherever they wanted to go. But it was triggered by a lack of food aid. and other kind of humanitarian assistance. I would appeal to you. Karen Bass and I just returned from South Sudan. It was my second trip within the last 9 months. We went to refugee camps. One refugee camp, one of the largest in the world, Bidi in Uganda, they're cutting food rations by 50% because it's not there. We did go to another camp, Bentu, which is an IDP camp in Unity State. And frankly, they had food, and a lot of it was courtesy of the United States government, so thank you for that. But we got to make sure that that food does not diminish. It needs to actually be increased. We're having a hearing tomorrow, it was scheduled for today, on the fact that some 14 million Africans are at risk of famine, and the driver, frankly, is conflict. But they have to get that food aid. Finally, I'll just say this on the issue of the conflict. I believe, and I think Karen would agree with this, that there's a window of opportunity with South Sudan and Salva Kiir and his leadership to really put pressure on them to end this conflict, which is a Nuer versus Dinka conflict. He's got a new chief of staff for the military who seems to be saying all the right things. His previous one was a disaster. And the rapes and the interruption of convoys on their way to deliver foodstuffs and humanitarian assistance are disrupted by the military. So please, there needs to be an all-out effort on South Sudan right now to act on this window of opportunity, Mr. Secretary.
Well, as to the human trafficking report, as I said in my opening statement, we'll see the world as it is. We'll be honest with ourselves and the American people. So let me assure you that report will be reflective of what the circumstances actually are. On the food aid, you are correct. So much of this is complicated by conflict. We appreciate Congress gave us a big plus-up on food aid this past year. Some of that money, I guess I can say regrettably, is going to carry over to 2018. It has to do with our ability to deliver, particularly in some of these conflict areas. We've had difficulty working with NGOs, getting some of the food delivered because of issues in the case of the conflict around Syria, issues with NGOs and Turkey that you've read about. We're working with the government of Turkey to facilitate them approving and not stopping our ability to get aid into these regions. You mentioned parts of Africa, Yemen. There's a serious famine crisis in Yemen. Again, we're blocked, the aid workers, and we are blocked from being able to deliver to the people that need it. We are trying to work solutions in all of these areas with our first and highest priority, create conditions that we can at least get the humanitarian aid in while we're working on the conflict resolution itself.
Thank you.
We go now to Mr. Gregory Meeks of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. Let me just first say, Mr. Secretary, that what we're looking at, I understand the difficulty with the paperwork, et cetera, but just noted that the Bush and the Obama administration was way ahead at this point as far as hiring and the number of individuals that we had at various levels at the State Department. But let me ask you a couple of questions, and maybe you can clear them up for me as I travel around. These are questions that I'm often asked, and I've been unclear with some of the answers, and so maybe you can answer them in the vein of what we talked about here in a yes or no answer. Are you in favor of America First nationalism?
America First, as we've said, does not mean America alone. We will continue our strong alliances and partnerships and maintain the friendships, relations that we have around the world.
Okay. So now, because of, some of the, I guess, statements that the President has made about America First, and he has said that a lot of the other countries around the world have to give things back, or if we're not going to do this or that, in his words, and by just using the words, just America First in that regard, do you see any negative consequences to America's standing internationally as a result of the America First, which would which would seem to indicate to the rest of the world that it is about us and only about us, if you just take that language?
Congressman, that's why the Vice President, myself, Secretary of Defense, others have been making numerous trips, the President himself with his trip abroad. We have to ensure our partners and allies understand what that moniker conveys. And I think what we have had good dialogue with them about is it does not mean America is stepping back or that we only worry about our own self-interest. Rather, as I indicated, we live in some really challenging times and a lot of things are changing. We have to ask our allies and friends to do more and take more responsibility in these great alliances that we have.
Okay, so let me,
And what I'm hearing back is they are glad we are engaged. I have seen no indication that our relationships have been undermined with this very open, frank, and honest conversation we're finally having with people.
short period of time I have. So let me just ask this so that we can be clear. So do we support, because I know that the president has said that he doesn't generally agree with multilateral agreements or multilateral organizations. He would rather do things on a bilateral basis. So do we support the EU?
I think
Yes or
we've
no?
been quite clear that we do,
NATO?
without a doubt.
OAS?
Certainly,
WTO?
yes.
The
But
UN?
WTO needs some reform.
The UN?
Yes, the UN needs a lot of reform.
The Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation?
Yes,
So we will work, and we're going to, solidly with all of those.
we are engaged with every one of those organizations you named, and those that are quite effective, we want to strengthen them. Some of them need significant reform, and that's not just the U.S. point of view. That
I'm
point
just
of
trying to
view
make
is
it
held
clear
by
because
many.
for some, quite frankly, Secretary, what has happened is, the truth of the matter is, as you've traveled and General Mattis, et cetera, and the Vice President, they've heard one thing, and it seems as to be that people are relieved when they've heard you speak. Then the president tweets or says something else that seems to contradict what you say. And so then people come to me and they don't know what to believe, whether or not it is the words of the Secretary of State or the President of the United States. That's not your fault. There's nothing you do. I don't want to go in the little bit of time I have. I really want to jump then real quickly into this issue that we have just talking about the budget, because 21% of the diversity in the State Department has come from the utilization of the fellows from either the Pickering or the Rangel fellows. And I understand that there's a freeze that's going on, and we've already spent $85,000 per person on on these students. So I'm wondering if and not these bright young individuals who can help diversify the State Department, that they can be waived from this freeze. They finished the program, they've been paid, we invested the money so that they can then take their spots in the Foreign Service. Is there any opportunity for them to be?
There is no freeze. The structure of the program, Rangel Pickering, which is very important to us, and we have every intention of continuing it, the obligation in the contract that the young people and others engage with us when we fund their tuition and for their graduate studies is that we confirm that we will offer them a position in consular affairs. That is confirmed, and it's a 5-year commitment on their part to serve. We then say we will put you on the list for consideration for the next A100 Foreign Service class. We are holding the next A100 Foreign Service class because, quite frankly, right now, on Foreign Service officer staffing, we're actually up about 50 people from the beginning of the year. With our expected manning, which we're looking at probably an 8% reduction by the end of fiscal 2018, in order for us to have time to manage how we want that to occur so that we do not diminish the strength of the Foreign Service Corps, we are holding on the next A100 class. So nothing's been frozen, and we want people to continue to apply, and they are all offered a position in consular affairs, and that is no change from the past. There's never been a guarantee that anyone would have a clear offer or a pathway to Foreign Service. They would be considered for Foreign Service based upon the work they've completed, but they always have an offer to go to work in consular affairs.
Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and let's just note that right from the very beginning, you outlined for us that we have been spending more money on our foreign projects and foreign goals than we have at historic levels have actually been lower. Let me just note for the record that this increase in spending levels, especially in the last 8 years, has not resulted in a more peaceful world or a more secure situation for the people of the United States of America. Let me note also, Mr. Secretary, that I am proud that we have a government now led, and we have a president who makes no apologies for putting America first in his priorities. What is important for the well-being, security, and prosperity of the United States is our job. And for us to try to blur that is not doing anyone a service. Achieving our goals, however, let's note, and putting America first, achieving our goals does not necessarily derive from higher budgets, but like you have committed to us today, working with other countries and making sure that we reach out to make friends and to make sure that we turn enemies into friends and get the job done for helping the less fortunate people of the world is something we will work together on and not just bear as a burden of the United States taxpayer. So I appreciate, number one, what this administration is doing and what you're doing, Mr. Secretary, to achieve those goals. I have some specific questions for you on specific areas. Number one, are we still giving money to Pakistan? Dr. Afridi, who fingered Osama bin Laden, the murderer of 3,000 Americans on 9/11, is being held in a dungeon there, and the Pakistanis continue, we know, the ISI continues with the notorious support of terrorist elements in Afghanistan. Why are we still giving Pakistan any aid at all?
Well, we are beginning an interagency policy review towards Pakistan. This is going to be one of the considerations. The President has asked the question specifically about our level of support and funding to Pakistan. No decisions to be taken until we complete that policy review. As you well can understand and appreciate, Pakistan and our relationship with them touches on some much broader issues relative to stability in Afghanistan and how we achieve that, but also stability in the Indo-Pacific region. It is a very complex relationship we have with the government of Pakistan, but your concerns are all well-founded.
I will trust you and trust this administration that we take a realistic view, and sometimes that means biting the bullet and having, when you're dealing with someone they've been two-faced with us for so long now. Pakistan is acknowledged by most of the people I've dealt with as the source of terrorism in that part of the world, and if we don't succeed in Afghanistan, it will be because of the ISI in Pakistan. With that said, Afghanistan looks like it's not going in the right direction, and there are some creative ways to handle this. We continue to have troops involved there, but some people are calling for more troops. I hope that we look for other methods rather than sending American troops into Afghanistan.
Congressman, we have an Afghanistan policy, as you know, under review as well, and I mentioned that in the context of Pakistan because you cannot work one without the other. In the interim, though, we have had interagency discussions with the President about how to preserve the opportunity for a long-term solution in Pakistan where we do not Afghanistan, where we never allow Afghanistan to become the platform for terrorism to be launched against the United States or certainly others. That work we expect to complete over the coming weeks, review it with the President, make a final policy decision. But it has not been going well in Afghanistan. I would refer and defer to Secretary Mattis's assessment, and he testified to that effect this week. And I think there are steps we need to take to at least prevent further deterioration while we get our new policies in place. What we're following now are the policies of the prior administration, and we need to take some steps to stem the effects of those while we get our policies in place.
Thank you very much, Mr.
We go to Albio Series of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for being here. Mr. Secretary, I was not born in this country. I was born in Cuba. Growing up as a little boy, what I remember is the process of indoctrination, where the premise of the indoctrination was the destruction of America. Everything that was evil was America. We have a situation now where we have a White House that seems to ignore the facts that Russia was meddling our democracy. The most important thing in this world, I think, is a democracy that we have here. And the fact that some of these intelligence agencies have confirmed Putin's involvement in this. I ask you, why are we treating Russia with kid gloves? Why are you coming before us and telling us to give you flexibility when we have the premises of this country, of Russia, is to destroy this country? I think that the fact that we have a bipartisan effort now with this legislation to put some sanctions on Russia and to send a strong message that this is something that we would not allow, I just cannot understand why this White House seems to treat this man with such kid's gloves. Why don't we just talk and tell the reality? Tell the people of America from the White House. I know you have spoken about it, other members have spoken about it, but can you tell me, please, so I can rest a little better?
As I've characterized the relationship with Russia, and I did this after walking out of President Putin's office and went immediately to a press avail in Moscow, the relationship between the United States and Russia is at an all-time low post-Cold War.
But it's not,
it's
not us. It's their doing.
And it's getting
and
worse.
They haven't, excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt. I don't have too much time. But it's their efforts to undermine us.
And it's getting worse. And the two greatest nuclear powers on the planet cannot have this kind of a relationship. We have to move it to a different place. And that is what I've been asked to do, is to determine whether we can move the relationship to a different place that doesn't present the kind of threats to us and to the world that I am concerned the current relationship does and further deterioration would. And I fully appreciate and share the sentiment of all you just said, but the issue is, do we want to make the relationship worse? And where will that leave us? What is next? Or do we want to see if we can stabilize it and begin to deal with this?
But Mr.
There's a large number of issues on the table between us, including meddling in the elections. And do we want to try to deal with those towards some resolution? It may very well be that when we have progressed this discussion with them to some point where I will be the one to tell you we're getting nowhere. We're getting nowhere.
Mr. Secretary, I think we're going to the other
I'll be the
extreme
first
now.
to come back to you and tell you we should.
We're going to the extreme where we seem to be just giving into a lot of, you know, there are messages you can send without going into a nuclear war. You know, there are things that we can do and send strong messages to this country.
Sanctions are very useful tools. Unilateral sanctions are not quite as useful as multilateral sanctions. And we are, as we think about additional sanctions, one of my challenges, and I take this as my responsibility, is how do I bring other allies along with us to say to them, you must respond in this way as well, in order for these sanctions to be the effective pressure that I know we all want and that you desperately want. I agree with that. We can take unilateral action, but if we take it alone and we get little support from others, they will be somewhat hollow, and Putin will know they're hollow. And so this is it's a bit of a tactical discussion you and I are having at this point, not a fundamental discussion around intent, objectives. Our interests are completely aligned, let me assure you. This is really a tactical difference of opinion, I think.
Well, I do hope that you send this message to the president and tell him that, you know, there are a lot of people looking at how he behaves towards Russia. And quite frankly, I am very concerned. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go to Steve Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Tillerson, for being with us here today. I've been a member of this committee for 2 decades now. I've chaired the Middle East Subcommittee and the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee as well. And the issue I'd like to discuss with you this morning is Taiwan. As a founding member of the Congressional Taiwan Caucus and having been to that nation, and I use that term nation intentionally quite a few times, and I take the commitments of our country that we've made with Taiwan very seriously, and I believe that you do too. Taiwan is a close ally of ours. It's one that truly exercises freedom and democracy and can be a role model to other nations facing an aggressive, bullying neighbor. Taiwan faces an unrelenting threat from China, which is nearly 600 ballistic missiles aimed directly at Taiwan. And although Taiwan enjoys de facto independence, China's ultimate goal, as we know, is the annexation of the island. Therefore, the Taiwan Strait remains a potential hotspot. The PRC's aggression towards Taiwan has only grown over the years. The PRC more and more is referring to Taiwan as a core interest to them. They continue to block Taiwan's participation in international gatherings, and the world, including the United States, embarrassingly, usually yields to China's bullying. Further, China continues its long campaign to pressure nations around the world to stop their recognition of Taiwan, and Panama just this week announced its intention to yield to that pressure. Fortunately, the 38-year-old Taiwan Relations Act is still alive and in place, and this historic legislation has thus far maintained peace and stability. But we must be clear to the PRC that if push comes to shove, the United States will stand with Taiwan. Now, Mr. Secretary, a couple of questions. China would never allow us to determine who they can meet with, yet because of fear of offending China, principally, we won't allow high Taiwanese officials to set foot in this city, our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., right here. Some years back, a couple dozen members of Congress, including myself, had to get on a plane and fly to New York City one evening after votes to meet with the president of Taiwan, President Chen. I know some other members are nodding because they were on that same plane with me, because he wasn't allowed to come here to our nation's capital. Now, an important bill to remedy this, which I've introduced in previous Congresses as well, H.R. 535, the Taiwan Travel Act, would allow the President, Vice President, Foreign Minister, Defense Minister to come here, and it's being marked up tomorrow in the Asian Pacific Subcommittee, and I'd welcome the administration's support for that measure, and I'd appreciate your comment, please.
Well, I think, Congressman, you have summarized it quite well in terms of the situation as we see it today between China and Taiwan. As you know, the China-U.S. relationship has been defined for the past 50 years by our one China policy and our agreement around one China policy. They have their interpretation of what that means, and we have ours, and we've agreed that we will accommodate each other's interpretation. But it has led to 50 years of stability in the region. It has prevented conflict and has allowed for this enormous economic growth that has gone on, much of which we have benefited from. As we began our dialogue with Chinese leadership with this new administration, as you know, there was some questioning of our commitment to one China early on. The President has reaffirmed that we are committed to the one China policy. We are also completely committed to the Taiwan Relations Act and fulfilling all of our commitments to them under that act. But we are also in a discussion with China now about what is our relationship going to be for the next 50 years. How do we enter another era of stability and absence of conflict? And Taiwan, clearly to the Chinese, is a part of that discussion. So it is important as we engage with them that we are able to fulfill our commitments to Taiwan, which we have every intention of doing, and that the question is the one China policy sustainable for the next 50 years? And those are the kind of discussions we're having. They are extremely complex in many regards. But this is what we seek as another 50 years of stability and no conflict with China in the Pacific region. Taiwan is a big element of that. North Korea is a big element of that. Their island building and militarization of islands is a significant element of that. All of these are in our discussion with them about how do we define this relationship for the next half century to ensure we have a continued era of no conflict and stability.
Thank you, ma'am. My time's expired.
We go now to Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here today. Mr. Secretary, I guess I'm wondering what the Trump doctrine means. Because to some of us, it looks like making America great again in the realm of foreign policy means unilateral withdrawal and disruption. We've renounced our own Trans-Pacific Partnership trade agreement. We've threatened to renegotiate NAFTA with our two largest trading partners and have had unfriendly assertions with both. We've renounced the Paris Climate Agreement, signed by 195 countries. We've now joined the happy company of two, Nicaragua and Syria. What a proud moment for our country. We've threatened the NATO alliance with being, quote, obsolete, and refused in Europe at the moment it was expected to reaffirm Article 5 and our commitment to it. We've embraced Russia in a way that is disturbing, I think, for most Americans. The President personally championed Brexit to the enormous consternation of our closest ally, the United Kingdom. He has embraced strongmen, Duterte of the Philippines, Erdogan of Turkey, Putin of Russia, El-Sisi of Egypt, while lecturing our closest allies about their commitments. And in your budget, he's proposed a 32% cut in the Function 150, Function 300 international affairs functions of the budget that would cripple our ability, frankly, to engage in serious diplomacy. And of course, there's the UN, with constant threats of pulling out of specialized agencies and even peacekeeping operations. Mr. Secretary, how does a reasonable observer of that sorry and lamentable litany not conclude otherwise than this constitutes a serious unilateral withdrawal from long-term post-World War II commitments, values, and policies of the United States government?
Well, Congressman, my assessment of all, if I listen to that entire list of areas, we can go down them. A withdrawal from TPP was by and large supported by most people in this body and up here on the Hill. There was little support for
Mr.
TPP.
Secretary, I know we could pick one or two from the litany.
Well, I'm picking your list.
Well, are you going to go down the whole list? Because we're going to run out of time.
Well, if you're not interested in
I am interested, but I'm just worried about time. And my question really wasn't about a particular item on the list. It was, does this add up to a radical alteration in our foreign policy? You're the Secretary of State.
It does not add up to a radical alteration of our foreign policy. I think in my statement, I made a couple of comments that, in my view and in my assessment, many of our institutions have never responded to the post-Cold War era. With the fall of the Soviet Union, a whole array of dynamics were unleashed globally. After 9/11, a whole new array of threats were unleashed. And we have continued to try to address those with the old constructs. Not that the constructs are not valid, and not that the constructs don't give us the frame and the relationships, but we have to begin to examine the effectiveness of those. And I think what the President is doing is he's examining all of these elements, and we are questioning whether they are as effective as they should be, and whether our partners and allies have come as far as we have come in commitments. And so I would call this an elevated level of engagement, not in any way withdrawal. I think what people are questioning is because we are making certain demands of allies and partners, and we are having this very frank, open, honest conversation with them that needs to occur. It needs to occur so
Mr.
that
Secretary,
people take as difficult a decision around this as we take. That will strengthen our alliances. There will be greater commitment toward this, not less.
Mr. Secretary, to call this an elevated involvement in the world would embarrass even George Orwell. I yield back.
We go to Mr. Joe Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and our prayers are with our colleagues who are not here today due to the baseball practice shooting. Congressman Jeff Duncan of South Carolina, Congressman Mo Brooks of Alabama, Congressman Ron DeSantis of Florida. Mr. Secretary, I especially appreciate your Exxon service. My heritage is Exxon. My great-grandfather started with Standard Oil in Richmond in 1890. My grandfather was the division manager of Standard Oil, New Jersey in South Carolina. My dad was a sales representative for Esso Humble, and my brother has been an oil jobber for Exxon. So I know of the integrity of the company that you've led. Also, I was really pleased to see of your Scout background. All credit to my wife. We have 4 Eagle Scouts in our family. So thank you for what you've done. With so many global challenges, the rogue nation North Korea continues to push against international norms and threatens our nation's security and the security of our allies. I'm concerned that large cuts in our foreign affairs budget will leave us at a disadvantage in the distinct national security role played by our diplomats so capably. I appreciate your willingness to make significant reforms to the foreign affairs budget and support your continuing the State Department's critical missions around the globe. Secretary Tillerson, on the threat of the unstable and dangerous North Korean regime, each week there are reports of nuclear developments, missile tests, ridiculous videos showing Americans being killed and Americans being unlawfully detained. There's bipartisan support and concern. Recently, Congressman Adam Schiff and I introduced H.R. 2732, the North Korea Travel Control Act, which would prohibit travel to North Korea. Given the recent release of Otto Warmbier and Dennis Rodman's travel to North Korea, do you support the prohibition of U.S. tourist travel to North Korea?
We have been evaluating whether we should put some type of travel visa restriction to North Korea. We've not come to a final conclusion, but we are considering it.
And my concern, indeed, that tourists go there is simply supporting a dictatorial, totalitarian regime. I say this with my colleague, Congressman Elliot Engel. He and I are the only 2 members of Congress who've actually been to Pyongyang, but it was on a congressional delegation, not as a tourist. Thank you very much for your service.
We go now to Ted Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And even as we pray for the majority whip and the others who were injured this morning, I'd just like to take a moment to acknowledge and express our gratitude to the Capitol Police who permit us to do our job every day, keeping us safe as well as all who are here in this room today. So we're grateful for what you do. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I wanted to first add my voice to those who have spoken out against the budget and in support of a robust international affairs budget. I would just point out that a 32% cut to the State Department cannot be solely about cost savings to the U.S. government when the defense budget is being increased by 54%. American leadership, as you know, Mr. Secretary, has always been and must continue to be about more than just military might. Next, I wanted to ask you about a hearing yesterday in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. You were asked about payments made to Palestinian prisoners and their families, hundreds of millions of dollars per year, payments that are made to those who stab or ram or shoot Israelis, payments to suicide bombers, payments that only incite violence and, frankly, prevent movement toward a two-state solution. The issue came up, as you pointed out, in bilateral meetings, and yesterday in response to the question you said they have changed that policy. Their intent is to cease payments to families who have committed violence and murder against others. Can you provide further clarity on the supposed change in policy, since Palestinian officials quickly responded by saying that there are no plans to stop these payments to families of Palestinians killed or wounded in carrying out these attacks?
Those were assurances that were given to me in the most recent trip to Bethlehem. We have had conversations with them and told them they cannot continue these types of payments and expect the U.S. or the American people to see any explanation for why they do that. They have indicated they would. They indicated to me they were in the process of changing that. They did say we have to support widows and orphans. I said widows and orphans is one thing. Attaching payments as recognition of violence or murderers is something the American people could never accept or understand. So we will continue this dialogue with them. We have been quite clear as to our view.
I appreciate your making that clear. Unfortunately, it appears that the position has not yet changed. Finally, I want to raise an issue that I have raised every single time a Secretary of State has sat before this committee in the 7 years that I've served here, and that's the case of my constituent, Robert Levinson. Bob went missing in 2007. He is, Mr. Secretary, the longest-held American hostage. As you know, Bob was not part of the 2016 deal that saw 5 American citizens released from Iran. But as part of that deal, commitments were made by Iran to assist in Bob's case. I have no doubt that there are those in Iran that know where Bob is or how to locate him, and I hope that the administration is making every effort to prioritize engaging on Bob's case. Unfortunately, the Levinson family has not received much high-level communication since January. I would like to acknowledge 2 of Bob's 7 children who are here with us today, his eldest son, Dan, and his youngest son, Doug. So first, Mr. Secretary, I'd just like to ask, 1, will you commit to meeting with the Levinson family?
We're happy to provide an update on anything we know, and just to assure you, as you know, we have regrettably, we have a number of American citizens who are detained illegally.
I understand. I would ask on behalf of
I just wanted to let you know, we have our attention on, we treat them as individual cases.
Will you meet with the family?
Yes.
Mr. Secretary.
Yeah.
Will you either designate a senior-level position in the department or fill the position of Special Envoy for hostage negotiations to liaise on a regular basis with the Levinson family and others?
We are evaluating people to fill that position. I would tell you, though, and I think it's important, we do not stop our efforts just because we do not have someone in that role. And I hope the evidence of our success already during this short term of our administration of securing release of people who have been detained, I hope people take encouragement from that, and I promise you that we have efforts underway for every detained
I understand. Sadly, it's 10 years now, so I'm just focused on Bob. I would ask that you raise Bob's case at every opportunity that you have. Can I ask, Mr. Secretary, whether you have plans to meet with the Iranians?
I have no current schedule to meet with the Iranians.
If you don't do it, which I think is a mistake, it's imperative that you press our allies to raise Bob's case in their communications with the Iranians or in any international fora. 10 years is simply too long for a family to go without their husband, father, and grandfather. Bob, Mr. Secretary, is going to become a grandfather for the 7th time in a matter of weeks. He should be home celebrating this joyous moment with his family. I appreciate your efforts and urge you to do everything you can to bring him home. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We go to Mike McCall of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. It's good to see a fellow Texan back in the Secretary of State position. I just got back from Mexico City. I chair the U.S.-Mexico Interparliamentary Group, and I just want to let you know that it was a very productive, civil, respectful meeting on security, energy issues, and NAFTA in terms of how we could put energy under the NAFTA umbrella. I know you know more about that topic than I do, and I think that would be certainly a win-win for both countries. I want to ask you about transnational criminal organizations. I had Secretary Kelly testify before my committee, stating it's one of the greatest threats facing the United States. He said that the cartels share ties with terror networks that we are currently fighting overseas, that they're a threat to the fabric of American society and have the ability to sneak drugs and people, including potential terrorists and dirty bombs, into the United States. And finally, he stated the nexus between criminal networks and terrorist networks is real, and I would predict we'll get more sophisticated. Do you agree with Secretary Kelly's comments?
Yes, I do. And that's why we have undertaken this joint effort with our counterparts in Mexico around trans-criminal organizations designed around getting at the supply chain of how illicit narcotics, but also human trafficking and other illicit activities are carried out across our borders. We clearly see the connections of these activities with terrorist organizations all the way back into and including ISIS. Working with our Treasury counterparts, this is part of our global effort to deny terrorist financing as well. But this effort really gets at the challenge to our own national security, but also the health and well-being of our citizens in terms of the number of drug-related opioid deaths. So it's a very comprehensive effort that we've had, we're advancing with cooperation from our Mexican counterparts. And I think you're going to see a very different approach to how we attack the problem of the cartels.
Well, that's great to hear. I think we've long neglected this. We had a classified briefing with Admiral Tidd yesterday, the Southcom commander. And without getting into the details of that, I know you're aware of that threat. And it does worry me as chairman of Homeland Security Committee what is coming from terror ties into the Western Hemisphere and then potentially across that U.S.-Mexico border, which I think that is why getting security both at the border with Mexico, but also Mexico's southern border, I think is so important. So let me just thank you for your attention to that, and I look forward to working with you on that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Karen Bass of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Secretary, I appreciated the discussion that we had the other day. I wanted to talk to you in regard to Africa and what our policy is on Africa. I appreciated that you were clear that you understand the significance of the continent and the role that we play there, but it's still not really clear what our overall policy is. And I'm in my 4th term here, and for the first time in the last couple of months, I've had a number of visits from our allies in the EU who have come and expressed a lot of concern about what is the direction that our country is taking in regard to Africa. They've read the budget, they understand the numbers, and they understand that a budget really reflects your values, your policy, and your direction. And so they have come to me asking, where is the United States going in regard to Africa? And when I think of the continent, there's 3 different things that come to mind, and I raise these in reference to the cuts in the budget. So from the national security perspective, we know that on the continent of Africa, there are many fragile democracies that can easily collapse and that quickly open the door to terrorism. So I'm concerned about the cuts to the democracy programs as well as to the cuts to UN peacekeeping. And I know that we pay a considerable share, but we also don't send our troops, and other countries do. In terms of humanitarian assistance, especially including health and cutting food aid, and when we had the crisis with Ebola, we certainly know how quickly that could have spread to the United States. So our interest is very much at stake. And when I think of the economic perspective on Africa, and we discussed the tremendous opportunities for U.S. businesses, U.S. jobs, but then I look at the budget cuts regarding OPEC and MCC, the African Development Foundation, and all of those are key institutions to really lay the basis for our businesses to do business on the continent. So one of my questions to you is, you described a process that you're going through with the State Department, a listening tour to look at how to run things more efficiently. And usually what happens in processes like this is that you have the process first, and then you come up with the number that you need to actually deliver what the State Department and USAID should do. And so my question is, were you involved in determining the 30% cut, or was it imposed on you? And is your review process designed to fit into the cut?
We had an interactive process with the OMB director. We gave him a pass-back budget. We were then given the budget back that I'm here today to present. And so my view is, if these are the resources that are going to be available to us, how do we want to prioritize the areas that we can have greatest impact? And I indicated this in my opening statement. I think when we, in terms of Africa, and I appreciate the discussion you and I had the other morning, I thought it was quite useful. We share this same list of both concerns and opportunities that you do. I would point to the fact that we have a lot of other areas of our budget that we can bring resources to bear on these particular concerns and issues. We have money in our de-ISIS budget that allows us to address some of the threats of an emergence of ISIS on the continent of Africa, either in North Africa, and certainly we're keeping our eye on Libya, or through the Sahel. And we are working with other multinational partners to defend against and not allow a reemergence on the continent itself.
Thank you. And Mr. Secretary, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm about to run out of time. I wanted to ask you about one other area. I had heard that before you were confirmed that a message was sent to the State Department to go through and identify any program that was focused on women. And I want to know, number one, was that true? And there is a specific program, the African Women's Entrepreneurial Program, and I don't know, I can't tell from the budget detail whether that is scheduled to be cut. And then, you know, just returning from South Sudan and knowing that rape is used as a weapon of war, very concerned about family planning services. And I mean birth control, I'm not referring to abortion at all. But whether or not we would seek to eliminate birth control, especially in countries where we know that rape is used as a regular practice of war.
I'm not aware of any directive that was sent before my arriving there. We certainly have not carried out any directive of that nature while I've been there.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. We go to Ted Poe of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. Thank you for your long-time service as a fellow Houstonian. I want to congratulate you on your position. I appreciate you being here as well. I live in Humble, Texas, so you can assume where we got our name from. First, I want to thank you for your personal involvement in the release of Sandy Fan Gillis, a Texan who had been imprisoned unlawfully by China for over 2 years. She was unlawfully in prison there. She was on a mission from Houston to work on economic things in China and then arrested when she got on the plane. But thank you for your personal involvement and the President's involvement. Now she's released and she's back home in Houston. I want to thank you for that on behalf of their family. I want to go over several things, and I'll eventually have a question as well. The State Department can lead the effort to designate the IRGC as a state or as a sponsor of terror. I personally think that the State Department should designate them as a sponsor of terror under 13224, and I would hope that would be on your radar to do. They are doing bad things throughout the world on behalf of terrorism and destroying human rights of many people. I'd like to know what the policy is of the U.S. toward Iran. Do we support the current regime? Do we support a philosophy of a regime change, peaceful regime change? There are Iranians in exile all over the world. Some are here. And then there's Iranians in Iran who don't support the totalitarian state. So is the U.S. position to leave things as they are or to support a peaceful, long-term regime change? I want to mention Russia. Second issue, I was in Georgia in 2008, about a week after the Russians invaded. I know Congressman Smith was there when the Russians actually did invade Georgia, took 1/3 of the country. Basically, the world said that's not nice and nothing happened. And then in 2014, they took Crimea. They're in eastern Ukraine now. And does our policy, U.S. policy, that was unlawful and is still unlawful, and that those territories in Georgia must be returned to Georgia, and the Crimea and as well as eastern Ukraine be returned to Ukraine, or we're just going to accept the Russian invasion of those territories? And the last thing I want to mention is Pakistan. I think Pakistan's playing us. We give them money. That money ends up in the hands of bad guys in Afghanistan who hurt Americans. And I personally think that Pakistan should not get any American money. They get $500 million a year, not counting the military. They should be designated as a state sponsor of terror, and they also should be removed from the major non-NATO ally status that they have. But I know this has been a discussion for years that try to get Pakistan on board to do the right thing. They don't. And what are we going to do? I heard your comments earlier. Is any of those things, or any of those things that I mentioned, options? So Iran, Russia, Pakistan, and I'll let you comment on that.
Well, our Iranian policy is under development, has not yet been presented to the President. But I would tell you that we certainly recognize Iran's continued destabilizing presence in the region, their payment of foreign fighters, their export of militia forces in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, their support for Hezbollah. And we are taking action to respond to Iran's hegemony. Additional sanctions actions have been put in place against individuals and others. We continually review the merits, both from a standpoint of diplomatic but also international consequences of designating the Iranian Revolutionary Guard in its entirety as a terrorist organization. As you know, we have designated the Quds. Our policy towards Iran is to push back on this hegemony, contain their ability to develop, obviously, nuclear weapons, and to work towards support of those elements inside of Iran that would lead to a peaceful transition of that government. Those elements are there, certainly, as we know.
Excuse me, Mr. Secretary, I'm out of time, and I would like a written response to those questions. And I have a constituent named Claudia who sent me some excellent questions to ask you, and I hadn't gotten there. I'll submit these to the record as well.
Without objection.
And thank you very much for your service and being here today. I yield back.
William Keating of Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I speak for all my colleagues this morning as it's been difficult through this hearing not to keep in our minds our colleague Steve Scalise and our other colleagues, the staff and Capitol Police who are injured and their families. And I want to thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your willingness to serve your country. This committee has had a great experience as long as I've been here working in a bipartisan fashion with the administration, trying to find areas of commonality. And I mean this sincerely. I'm not going down this path. It's just a clarification, if I could, for our ability to interact with the administration. Nothing more than that. But I want to get a better idea to clarify the position of Jared Kushner and the administration. And he has a major foreign policy position, but is he coordinating with you? What's your experience? Has he ever engaged in foreign policy discussions without prior coordination with the State Department? How would you define his role?
Mr. Kushner is a senior advisor to the President, so he does attend discussions, not all, but discussions we have in the West Wing from time to time. And I would say there's a clear recognition by him as to where foreign policy is conducted. It's in the State Department. It's by the Secretary of State. And so I would say his role is one of any other senior advisor in the West Wing. He has a freedom, and I've invited him, as I have others, certainly the National Security Advisor, McMaster, and others, to call if there are issues that arise in the West Wing. Let me know so we have visibility so we can begin talking about how we want to address those.
Does he coordinate? Do you have any instances where he hasn't coordinated with State or yourself before engaging in discussions with foreign nationals or officials?
You'd have to ask him.
Okay.
As to whether he has.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You spoke earlier about the working relationship with China in terms of North Korea. And there have been positive steps. And I want to congratulate you on your work in that regard. But one of my concerns is the fact that as China might move away from trade opportunities to try and pressure North Korea, Russia seems to be creeping in with those, replacing that vacuum with their own trade opportunities and other interactions with North Korea. Have you addressed this to Russia? This is a problem, I think, that we'll have in dealing with the North Korean situation, because if Russia just comes in and tries to fill that vacuum, then our work with China won't be as effective as it could be.
We have seen that occur already as China has withdrawn certain support. Russia has backfilled that. Yes, North Korea is among our top items that I speak to Foreign Minister Lavrov frequently about. I also had very extensive discussions directly with President Putin in the Kremlin when I saw him. We are asking for their help. I think Russia is evolving its own position relative to North Korea, and we're looking for more support from them. I think two indications of late. One was their affirmative vote in the UN Security Council for the additional sanctions on North Korea. Typically, at best, the Russians would abstain. This time, they actually voted for these additional sanctions. I think that indicates that they see it differently. They have also made their own public statements that they see these activities by North Korea as being a threat now to Russia.
Yeah.
And so that is part of our dialogue with the neighborhood is, look, this is not just a threat about us. This can become a threat about you as well.
Good. Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'll yield back.
Thank you for yielding back, Mr. Keating. And now we go to Mr. Darrell Issa of California.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I was delighted when you were named, and I keep reminding my friends that one of the last great secretaries we had was George Shultz, who for 6 years before, not immediately, but just before, had run a global enterprise, one that was responsible for building large and small cities. And so I'm going to kind of segue from that to one of the areas you inherited that I want you to be aware has been an intention of this committee and of the Oversight Committee. During the George W. Bush era, under General Williams and others, the State Department began a standard design build process. This allowed the State Department to go from an aging embassy system that lacked security and that was falling behind, where most of the money was being spent just trying to keep crumbling embassies going, to getting new, modern facilities that were secure and predictable in operation. Upon the change of administration, there was a change under Hillary Clinton, and she began going back to the old practice of New York wine and cheese liberals happily designing works of art. And I'm trying to be over the top for a reason, because if you go to Great Britain, where you find that glass palace on an undersized lot that we can't use, that we're paying extra, what you find is a return to embassies that might be works of art. They may make great statements about America's prowess and place in the world, but you're not being given, as you know, enough money to build embassies just to provide security, the likes of which we didn't have at Benghazi, and we didn't have in a lot of other places. By the way, I was also thrilled when Ambassador Patrick Kennedy abruptly left with a team that I'm glad to see go. So now my question to you is, with the President's current budget, quite frankly, reduced in that area, can you, by changing back to a process of efficient design and build, can you begin to get us caught up to where never again will we have people die because they have a facility that lacks the basic security required by your own regulations?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. The current budget around security, both security services as well as embassy construction, will allow us to maintain our program pretty much through 2018. We will begin to have planning difficulties in 19 at this level, and we're in discussions. Certainly we'll have discussions with OMB about that. But I think to your point about our execution against embassy construction, it really is an execution issue, and I agree we need to get back to standard designs, fewer scope changes. We don't need to be unique every place. I'm a fit for purpose guy, and I think we need to build what's needed for us to deliver on mission. And there are some execution issues. I've been reading reports from OIG of audits they've been doing of various projects, and I recognize a lot of the deficiencies. I've seen them in the private sector when the private sector struggles with major construction projects. So I think we have a lot of opportunity to improve that and get back to fit-for-purpose approach.
Well, I'd like to follow up with another area on that, and very briefly. Because you have OCO funding, and because if we really look at your facilities around the world, they're often facilities in which Title X individuals and others assigned to you need to operate in, or at least coordinate in dangerous areas. So I might suggest that a very good investment of several $1 billion over the next several fiscal years would be to springboard ahead to have those facilities able to house both the diplomatic mission and coordinate other missions in the area. And I'm thinking particularly of Africa and some of the other hotspots. What I'd like to do is segue, though, to two things. One is you have 1,000 Marines available to you. This was a post-Benghazi decision to plus up. I can tell you that when I hear that Papua New Guinea's facility gets stopped and a whole new one getting designed, and part of the justification is they needed room for Marines, again, Papua New Guinea, that perhaps looking at where you best would have those 1,000 Marines could well be a good investment in moving them around, and of course having them match facilities to the greatest extent possible that you plan on having and we would otherwise build. Lastly, the President's budget did a 50% cut in the in an office which was conflict stabilization operations, which is under state, and the Office of Transition Initiatives, which is under USAID. We previously sent your agency under the last administration letters asking you to combine those two. And with the budget having a 50% cut, could you consider a 100% cut by combining them, deciding who gets this job, either state or USAID, but not both?
Well, again, I think part of our whole redesign is to look at exactly the kind of issues you've identified of where we have duplicative work efforts, overlap of work, not just within the State Department, but we find it interagency in ag, commerce, defense. And so this is going to be examining all these areas, which ultimately I suspect will lead certainly to combined efforts, delivering on mission for less cost.
Thank you. Yield back.
Thank you. I appreciate that. This committee will recess at 10 minutes before noon to allow us to join our colleagues on the House floor. And following the prayer and pledge, there will be brief remarks from the Speaker and the Democratic leader concerning the shooting incident this morning. And then this hearing will resume afterwards at 12:30 or so. And I'd like to thank the Secretary for his flexibility. And we'll adjourn here no later than 1:30. So at this time, let me go to Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I think it is very clear that the devastating cuts proposed in this budget would make it nearly impossible for America to lead the world, and it's why it has been decried by virtually every serious diplomat, scholar, and development expert. So I want to associate myself with the remarks of my colleagues about this budget and what it would mean for our diplomatic work. And I have very specific questions, Mr. Secretary, which I would ask you to answer with yes or no if you can, so I can get through as many of them as possible. First, Mr. Secretary, I assume you are familiar with the First Amendment and the rights that it affords to the American people.
Yes.
And do you believe that an open and unrestricted press is a vital part of a transparent and accountable government?
Yes.
And in your observations, do China and Russia have a free and unfettered press free from government influence?
No.
And so do you believe that Chinese and Russian media sources reliably and accurately report meetings or conversations between U.S. government officials and their governments?
Not likely.
So do you believe that it impacts the narrative or sends any type of message to the leaders of Russia, China, or other authoritarian-leaning governments when American media is excluded from reporting on significant events involving yourself, the President, or the other senior American diplomats?
I'm not sure I understood that one.
Well, do you believe it impacts the narrative or sends a type of message to the leaders of other countries when American media is excluded from reporting on significant events involving you, the President, or other senior American diplomats? You may remember a meeting in which American media was excluded and Russian media was permitted in the Oval Office.
It's hard for me to say what impact that particular limited incident had.
Okay. Next, Mr. Secretary, you are aware that the Chechen government, which is an arm of Vladimir Putin, has been engaged in a concerted campaign of kidnapping, detention, torture, and murder of gay men in Chechnya. Are you not?
I'm aware of those reports, yes.
And my colleagues and I sent you a letter raising this issue on April 7th of 2017. And my question is, did you discuss the issue of these atrocities being carried out in Chechnya when you met with the Foreign Minister Lavrov on May 10th? Or any other government officials at any other time?
Those are on our pending list.
So you have not discussed them at all?
We did not make our way through all of the issues in the meetings we had.
Are you aware whether the President has raised this issue with President Putin?
I'm unaware of whether he has or not.
Well, will you here today in this hearing condemn the torture and murder of gay men in Chechnya and state that it is the policy of the United States government at the highest levels that the Russian government must protect the lives and safety of all of its citizens, including the LGBT community?
That is our position globally.
And in Russia as well?
Last time I checked, Russia's part of
So
the
that's a yes?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Next, Mr. Secretary, I assume you are familiar with the events that took place in Washington, D.C. outside the Turkish embassy on May 6th.
I am.
I assume you do not believe it is appropriate for a foreign security force to assault Americans on American soil.
I do not.
Have you or the President had conversations with President Erdogan or the Turkish ambassador about this incident?
We called the Turkish ambassador over to the State Department immediately and spoke to him. I have had face-to-face conversations with the Foreign Minister, Çavuşoğlu, on the margins of the NATO meeting. The matter is under investigation by Washington, D.C. police and the court system, and we are awaiting conclusion of that investigation for further action.
And so once those prosecutions are concluded, you will consider actions in response to this egregious attack?
We want our action to be consistent with what the investigation shows.
And do you believe it's appropriate for the United States government to sell weapons to the very same security forces who committed this attack?
It's under evaluation.
Next, Mr. Secretary, when can Congress expect to receive the administration's plan to defeat ISIS and end the conflict in Syria?
We've had a recent update with the President on the plan going forward, both militarily, diplomatically, and then how to confront ISIS, the de-ISIS campaign globally, both in the communications networks and to deny them the financing.
And when can Congress expect a presentation of those plans?
I am not aware that there's been a request for one.
Okay. Well, consider this one, at least from one member of Congress. And finally, Mr. Secretary, would you say that our past efforts to counter Russian aggression in Europe and Eurasia have been successful?
It's a work in progress, and it requires work every day.
But has it been successful?
We have had some success. I think if you look at how certain countries in East Europe have progressed, progress in the Balkans, but challenged, progress in the Balkans.
So my question is, in light of that, after an unprecedented attack against our own elections, evidence of Russian attempts to hack and influence elections throughout Europe, as well as other mischief, how do you propose to adequately counter the Russian threat with a budget that is decimated by almost 60% in the account for countering Russian aggression? We haven't been successful, and your budget proposes cutting it by 60%. How can we be successful in countering Russian aggression with those kinds of resource reductions?
Our engagement is going to continue with those nations in East Europe that are most threatened. If we had additional funds, we would fan that back out to do more in some other countries, but we are going to remain engaged with those countries.
We go briefly.
Mr. Chairman, I may ask unanimous consent that the following three documents be placed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
We're going to go briefly to Scott Perry of Pennsylvania.
Secretary,
and then we will recess.
Great to see you. I, for one, although I might take some differences with some of the lines in the budget request, am thrilled that we finally have a commander-in-chief that's interested in balancing the budget of the United States, and I do consider that a national security priority. With that, Mr. Deutsch asked you about the Palestinian Authority and the 10% increase, and I will tell you, as at least one of us, and probably more than one, that is concerned and somewhat tired of continuing to fund the PA and hearing somewhat of the same rhetoric where we're going to discuss it, we're considering it, we have a commitment to end this stipends to murderers and terrorists. And I'm just wondering if you have a glide path, and I don't want to get into any discussion that would imperil your ability to be effective in this regard, but is there some way that you're using to assess how they're doing with that and to claw back some of that funds and use it for other things if they fail to comply with their commitment, whatever that is?
Well, I think the President's been very clear with the Palestinian Authority over actions he expects them to take, and he's indicated he has a certain window of patience and a certain window in which he's going to remain engaged and be interested, and at some point he's going to become disinterested.
Okay.
And if we become disinterested, that will certainly alter our level of support.
So just know we'll be monitoring, and we'll probably look to follow up to see if that, in fact, takes place. You also had a conversation regarding the IRGC and designating them. I'd like to throw the Muslim Brotherhood in there as well as two organizations, actors, if you will, that have the specific interest of the destruction of the West, in particular the United States. And while there might be some good components, if you want to characterize it that way, for these organizations, I'd like to engage in a little bit of a short conversation about designating each one of those sponsors of terrorism, what the pitfalls might be of doing so? What are the American people missing? Because they know these are bad actors, so what are we missing that we need to know about that is deleterious to designating these obvious sponsors of terrorism for what they are?
Well, I think as you just noted, the Muslim Brotherhood, which I think purportedly would have up to 5 million members, has become somewhat segregated within its own ranks, with a number of organizations within Muslim Brotherhood continuing to commit themselves to violence and terrorism. We have designated those organizations. At the top of the quality chain, if I can call it that, there are elements of Muslim Brotherhood that have now become part of governments. There are members of parliament in Bahrain that are parts of government. There are members in Turkey that are parts of government. And so in designating the Muslim Brotherhood in its totality as a terrorist organization, I think you can appreciate the complexities this enters into our relations with then the government of Bahrain, the government and other governments where Muslim Brotherhood has matriculated to become participants, and in those elements, they have done so by renouncing violence and terror. So that is one of the complicating issues around just taking a whole designation of Muslim Brotherhood. But I will tell you, it is on our watch screen. We've not taken our eye off of it, and we revisit this question periodically because it comes up in our foreign relations with others as well.
And I certainly appreciate the answer. I just hope that we do not allow the more moderate ones, the ones that denounce violence, to have the organization use them to be the umbrella on which they conduct all these other things, which is the specific downfall of the United States and continued vigilance. Finally, and the last question, Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, the deal with Saudi Arabia, and I couldn't get an answer on specifically how we were monitoring their support, their continued support of the exportation of Wahhabism, Salafism, and the terror that goes along with that fundamentalist view of Islam around the globe. Do you know of any metrics that the Department is following to support their claim that they are working on that? How are we gauging that? How are we going to determine whether they're following along with that portion of the agreement?
Well, one of the outcomes of the President's Summit in Riyadh was the creation of the Center to counter extreme Muslim messaging with Saudi Arabia. This center now exists. It was inaugurated while we were there. The center has a number of elements to attack extremism around the world. One of the elements that we are visiting with them about, and they have already taken steps, the Saudis, is to publish new textbooks that go into the schools that are in the mosque around the world. These textbooks are to replace textbooks that are out there today that do advocate extreme Wahhabism viewpoints around the justification for violence. We've asked that they not just publish the new textbooks, we've asked that they retrieve the existing textbooks so we get those back. That's just one example. This center is going to have a very broad range from social media to broadcast to how young imams are trained in the theological centers. And we are working with them today with the establishment of the new center. What are the measures that we will hold ourselves accountable to? That is one of the charges that the State Department is working with the Saudis and others as we bring this center up to an operating level.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Time's expired to you.
And without objection, the committee stands in recess, and we will return at approximately 12:30. The committee will reconvene at this time, and we will begin with questioning from Mr. Ami Bera from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your patience in this reconvening. You know, this is a tough day today, but it's with thanks to the Capitol Police. It's thanks to the men and women that not only protect us, but all across this country, protect not only communities across the country, but the men and women that are around the world protecting who we are. You know, I've stated this previously in committee. A world led by American leadership is a better world, and we can see that if we look back at the second half of the 20th century and the post-World War II world order. American leadership, leading with our values, with our morals, has created a better world, and most around the world recognize that. And that's really been predicated on a foreign policy plank that has three legs. Certainly our defense, but also development and diplomacy. And my concern with this budget is it cuts off two of those legs on that stool, and that stool is going to collapse. It devastates the diplomacy and development budget. Now, I know it's not your budget, Mr. Secretary, but as members of Congress who have a responsibility for setting priorities, et cetera, I have grave concerns and can talk about a number of areas that I find very, very troublesome in this budget. I'm going to focus, I'm a physician by training with a public health and global health background, and have some real deep reservations about some of the cuts to our global health development, some of the cuts to USAID, particularly a 15% cut to maternal and child health programs. That is very worrisome to me, the impact that those cuts potentially have around the world. And I think America is a great nation, but a great nation leads by our values and our morals, and we don't withdraw from the world. So, my concern is if those cuts go into effect, the number of women that potentially will suffer, the number of women that potentially will die. I think some of the cuts with regards to a potential billion-dollar reduction from PEPFAR, the zeroing out of family planning funds, are going to have devastating impacts. I watched and read the testimony and the question of our colleague across the Capitol, Senator Shaheen, discussing the extension of the Mexico City policy, and heard your answer to that your office would be studying the impact of the extension of the global gag rule. Can you give us assurances that in that 6-month time frame, when you get that report back, if we are seeing adverse impacts, that you would make recommendations to reverse that policy?
Well, Congressman, and thank you for the attention to that particular matter. I can't commit to you that I would seek a reversal of that policy. As I explained to to Senator Shaheen yesterday, our implementation of the policy was structured in a way in engagement with a number of our health partners to mitigate any effect on the delivery of their activities. We said we would do a 6-month check to see if it is impacting them. And one provision I left out in my response to her yesterday is if it is impacting any particular areas of our health care that we did not intend to impact, then in consultation with the Secretary of HHS, I, as Secretary of State, can issue waivers and allow the funding to continue. So the reason we want to do the 6-month check is to see what impact is it having.
Mr. Secretary, will you commit to providing us the results of that report and what you find at that 6-month check?
We'd be happy to share that.
Great. I also have real reservations about the impact of PEPFAR. Now, PEPFAR was started by a Republican president and has been a remarkable program, saving thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives in Africa. And I think President Bush would suggest that that is his proudest accomplishment. I'd like to hear further commitment as we look at how we engage in global health around the world with partnerships. And I understand that it's our responsibility to evaluate each program, that we have limited resources and limited funds, but I'd like to have this commitment that we're going to look at how we work with nonprofits around the world, how we work with allies in other countries around the world to continuing relieving suffering.
That is a fundamental element of our approach to how we manage these reductions. Even with these cuts, the $1 billion cut to PEPFAR, we will continue to be the leader in health issues globally, and PEPFAR is clearly recognized as a model program that should be replicated elsewhere.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going now to Mr. Paul Cook, Vice Chairman of the Committee of California.
It's good to see you again, Mr. Secretary. I missed some of the testimony, and I hope I'm not being redundant, but I wanted to talk about the Muslim Brotherhood, the impact in Qatar, and quite frankly, Turkey, and the strained relationship and how it is so difficult to find out one day you have an ally, next day you might have an adversary. And I know that's going to be very, very challenging with the Saudis and what has happened in the past few weeks, as well as the ongoing political situation in Turkey, which affects the whole Middle East and our policy. If you could address that, I would appreciate it. I've talked to you, I think, last week about the same thing. But Secretary Mattis had some input on it Monday night, and it's one which is doesn't necessarily have a military solution, but this is going to be right. You're going to be right in the eye of the storm.
Our relationship with Turkey is extremely important to the United States. It's also extremely important to NATO, to Europe, and clearly we are concerned about the evolution of events, particularly since the coup attempt in Turkey. I have traveled to Ankara. Obviously, President Erdogan has been here, so our level of engagement with Turkey is at a very high level of communication and engagement. And where we have issues of concern, we're talking about those, discussing them. Clearly, they have some issues with how we're executing our military plans in Syria to defeat ISIS. We are concerned about their engagements with Russia. The European Union is concerned about the relationships. Turkey sits at an extremely important place geographically, but also geopolitically. So it is an important relationship. It is quite complex right now. And our objective is not to worsen that relationship, but find ways to re-engage and strengthen it so that we can have some influence over the choices that they are making, particularly with respect to freedoms within the country, to continuing their role and their construct as a democracy.
Thank you, sir. I yield back.
Gentleman yield. Mr. Cook?
Sure.
I thank my good friend for yielding. Mr. Secretary, I would ask you, if you would, to your thought about waivers for the Mexico City policy in answer to my friend and colleague, Dr. Burra. I would hope that you would not go that route. That would have the perverse impact of incentivizing foreign non-governmental organizations to be non-compliant with the Mexico City policy. And I would point out to my colleagues that back in 1985, after Ronald Reagan first announced the Mexico City policy at the UN conference in Mexico City, hence its name, there were large numbers of NGOs, foreign NGOs, that said, we are not going to comply. I offered the amendment on the floor of the House of Representatives in 1985, which passed, and I fully expect we'll have an all-out legislative battle on the floor again, which I would welcome, with a policy that seeks to hold harmless unborn children in our foreign aid. Global health ought to be inclusive, not exclusive of unborn children, who we know now beyond any reasonable doubt are harmed in a way that is violence against children, whether it be by dismemberment or chemical poisoning. Abortion is violence against children, and it also has consequences in the negative for women. And the Mexico City policy, as you know so well, has 3 exceptions: rape, incest, and life of the mother, which tracks what Ronald Reagan did and what George W. Bush did, and the Bush one when he initiated the policy as well. So waivers would, and at the end of the day, when it only applied to family planning organizations, when I offered the amendment on the floor, Olympia Snow and others said, none of the groups are going to accept it. At the end of the day, all but 2 accepted it. and that was IPPF based out of London and Marie Stopes International. They all accepted it. So I would encourage you, waivers would be an incentive to a foreign, non-governmental organization. And again, American taxpayers, through the polling, have shown clearly that they do not want our foreign aid subsidizing and enabling the killing of unborn children overseas or anywhere else. That's why the Hyde Amendment domestically enjoys such strong support. So I just would offer that thought.
We go now to Lois Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Mr. Secretary of State. And I think today's a day where we all recognize our common humanity, as my thoughts are with my colleague and the other folks impacted by this shooting. So I'm going to I'll try to be kind and gentle. I'm always kind and gentle, aren't I? So in a very kind and gentle way, I want to say that I am sad to say that I think your budget is inhumane and dangerous. Okay, I had to say that. I don't want to turn this into an abortion fight at all, because that was not part of my remarks, but I just want to counter my colleague, who I respect very, very much, and just say that women having full access to reproductive choice and care is imperative for them to have a full and productive life, and I think it's important to the security of their community. But I'm going to move on. I wanted to mention, I remember the President said, I think he said he inherited a mess in talking about international affairs. So to me, it's very perplexing that he inherits a mess, and then you come in with a budget with almost a 1/3 cut in State Department activities. Over 120 retired four-star generals sent a letter opposing the cuts, saying this is not the time to retreat. Secretary Mattis, when he was commander of U.S. Central Command, says, if you don't fully fund the State Department, then I need to buy more ammunition. I guess this is the Trump doctrine, because he's putting billions of more dollars into ammunition and cutting, as my colleagues said before, two of the legs of our national security, which is diplomacy and development. I want to focus on what I think is one of the crown jewels of our development efforts, and that is our global health investments. And I know you would probably agree that diseases do not recognize international borders. Every year, almost 80 million people from other countries visit the United States. That was in 2016. And Americans took more than 77 million international trips. We have hundreds of thousands of military living overseas. So U.S. global assistance helps not only to protect people in other countries, but it protects the United States. And I hope you would agree that when these health initiatives help keep countries stable. When you have, one of my colleagues mentioned famine, but if you have disease, you have famine, you have inhumane conditions, it promotes not only people trying to escape the country, but it destabilizes countries, creating an environment for terrorism. George Bush, one of his great achievements was PEPFAR, which put us on track to end AIDS as a public health threat by 2030. I know you yourself has said it's a model for the world to follow, yet the President's budget cuts this by $1.1 billion. The Global Fund, which controls the spread of malaria, TB, and HIV, also that is getting cut by $225 million. And I know people say, well, why should we care what's happening in these other countries? I think that's one of the questions I want to ask you, which is this. Why, Mr. Secretary, why should we care about diseases in other countries?
Well, Congresswoman, I think you just gave the explanation for why we should care, and I do not.
All right, well, then I'll go on to
my... all. What I would point to, I know we're focused on the cuts. I think it's important to also focus on how much we still will be committing and spending towards these diseases, towards our global health efforts. We're not zeroing health out. these were difficult choices that were made in the budget. We do believe that we can attract others and other funding and enable continuation of these programs. And there is no stepping back from our commitment on PEPFAR to the countries. We're going to fully meet the commitments on our AIDS programs in PEPFAR. And we're fully meeting our commitments, fulfilling our 5-year pledge to Gavi. We don't intend in any way to abandon our efforts or abandon our view of how important these issues are.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
To Mr. Lee Zeldin of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. A few questions. First, I want to ask about Iran. Has Iran, I guess there's a lot of agreement that Iran has violated the spirit of the JCPOA. Have you seen any evidence that Iran has violated the letter of the JCPOA?
Well, we will await the quarterly report from the IAEA to see if they have found any specific violations. I have read the entire JCPOA agreement now for myself, so I can understand this spirit and intent. Quite frankly, it is a poorly constructed agreement. The bar for Iran's compliance is pretty low, and so it should not come as a surprise to people that they're able to comply. It is not that difficult for them to comply. Having said that, we intend a rigorous application of the compliance requirements and a rigorous confirmation from the IAEA that they are complying. The whole spirit and intent question is one that obviously is always open to interpretation by both sides. And importantly, remember the JCPOA is a multilateral agreement, so we have partners, I would say, that were on our side of the table, best I can tell. They will have their interpretation of that as well.
And thank you. And your predecessor pointed out that it was a political commitment. It wasn't a treaty. It wasn't an executive agreement. It was a political commitment, one that we didn't even ask for a signature on, an unsigned political commitment. Does the administration recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel?
The administration has not expressed a specific view in that regard.
I would encourage, stating my own position, I believe strongly that the administration should recognize Jerusalem as the unquestionable capital of Israel. Will the administration eventually move the American embassy in Israel to Jerusalem?
That decision is under evaluation by the President. Obviously, he'll have to make a decision coming up on whether to extend a final decision on that or not. He has not made that decision to my knowledge.
And the President was absolutely correct during the campaign when he had stated his position and intent then of moving the embassy, and I would encourage him to go with his instinct from the campaign and follow through with that pledge. How do you believe the United States can better leverage our foreign aid that we provide to the Palestinian Authority?
Well, I think, again, our engagement with them and our making clear on our expectations of how aid is utilized. One thing I'd like to clarify from this morning's hearing, several times in the question, people suggested our support to the Palestinian Authority was increasing next year. That is inaccurate. It's actually going down about $20 million, if I remember correctly. And to remind everyone, our aid does not go directly to the Palestinian Authority. It is given to them by way of Israel. And we work closely with them as to how that money is delivered and for what purposes it is delivered.
And I appreciate that point. And I would offer that whatever the United States can't do to the Palestinian Authority legally, we should also have the position that we also cannot do for the Palestinian Authority indirectly. I co-sponsor the Taylor Force Act, as I know a number of my colleagues in the House and the Senate do as well. I believe it's now one that has bipartisan support over on the Senate side, and that we should better leverage the aid that is provided for the Palestinian Authority, which includes providing certifications that the Palestinian Authority is not inciting violence. And as in the name Taylor Force Act, United States Military Academy graduate, the Palestinians are not only inciting violence on the part to target innocent Israelis, but they're doing so to target Americans as well.
And just, Congressman, just so you're clear, it was with that strong bipartisan sense of the Congress that we have taken the position with the Palestinian Authority in a very unequivocal way, that you either take care of this yourself or someone else is going to take care of it for you. And those are the words I have used with them.
And you have strongly stated that it's included recent statements where you have mentioned that the President brought this up with Abbas, that you had received assurances. It is in the news today that there are Palestinian officials pushing back on your position that the Palestinian Authority has agreed to stop providing these payments to financially reward terror. And I really do wish you the absolute best as Secretary of State in your pursuit here. And I'd love to talk to you further about those efforts moving forward in the weeks, months, and years ahead. I yield back.
We go now to Mr. Joaquin Castro of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for being here today and for your testimony. Obviously, cooperation between Congress and the State Department is important, but I'm concerned over what looks like a lack of cooperation within the executive. The policy of the White House and the State Department has not been completely aligned over the last several months. For example, mere minutes after you stated that the Saudi and Emirati blockade of Qatar hindered U.S. military action against ISIS, President Trump took to Twitter to praise the blockade. As you attempted to form an international coalition to isolate North Korea for its nuclear weapons program, President Trump called North Korean leader Kim Jong-un a smart cookie and said that he'd be, quote, honored to meet him, hurting your efforts. Your efforts to assure our European and Asian allies of our commitment to our alliances have similarly been undercut by the White House and the President. It was reported that when Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump stood up at their press conference and broached the idea of a one-state solution instead of a two-state solution, that you were in an airplane somewhere else and that the State Department was not part of those discussions. So my question is, how can Americans and our allies around the world have confidence in your word, in the State Department's position, and most of all, that it represents what President Trump believes?
Congressman, just to be clear, there is no gap between the President and myself or the State Department on policy. There are differences in terms of how the President chooses to articulate elements of that policy. In the instance of the Qatar example that you gave, where I made a statement at the State Department, I then attended a bilat with the President of Romania, with President Trump, and then he made his statement in the Rose Gardens. I was involved in writing his comments in the Rose Garden to reflect the strong message he wanted to send, which was not just to Qatar, but he said to everyone, to all countries, to stop the funding, stop the killing, stop teaching your young people hate. That was the way he wanted to deliver.
Sure.
He wanted to deliver a very strong message. But
Secretary, I know.
there is no daylight between he and
Sure.
I.
hear you. Jared Kushner has been given reportedly given a big portfolio with respect to foreign affairs. Who is responsible for the foreign affairs of our country? Is it the Department of State and yourself, or is it Mr. Kushner in the White House?
It is the Department of State and myself, and that has been reconfirmed by the President to me on multiple occasions.
Part of the reason I ask these questions, in February, I was in Japan and South Korea, and this was the biggest question people had. When we look to the United States, who speaks for the President reliably? Whose word can we trust? I know you can understand how important that is for our allies and also for our adversaries. So why would the State Department be left out of any discussion about one of our most important foreign policy issues, whether you're going to have a one-state solution or a two-state solution? You can see how that is quite strange and bizarre.
Well, I think that came out of the bilateral private meeting between the President and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I think, to be fair, what the President was indicating is that whatever approach the two sides, the Palestinians and the Israelis, want to take to achieve a peace accord, we will support. And I think what he was saying is we're prepared, he is prepared to put his shoulder to the wheel to see if we can move a process along, and he is going to be unconstrained and exploring any and all other alternatives, because the alternatives everyone has pursued now for so many years have not produced a result. And I think these are some of the changes that people have a difficult time perhaps understanding tactically.
Yeah, and thank you for that.
The President is saying, let's explore everything.
Let
I'm
me
not
just make
wedded to anything.
let me make one last comment. First, I don't mean it as a knock on your leadership or your record at the department. I believe that you've been put in a very difficult position, and it's not just yourself, it's other members of the cabinet, where they essentially will make a statement believing what they believe to be the President's position, only to have the President go on Twitter or otherwise make a contradictory statement. But in all of it, it's very unsettling for Americans to try to understand where our government is headed, where the President is headed, but even more unsettling for allies who are not in the United States and have no other indicators by what they, but then what they hear on the news. So we would just ask, I would just ask for, I guess, more thoughtfulness from the executive branch on how they approach these things.
So we go now to Mr. Ted Yoho of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good seeing you again. Appreciate you being here. As we talked the other day, about 10 years ago, there were 25 conflicts around the world. Today, there's over 75. There certainly are no shortages of great challenges in the world. But with the challenges come great opportunities. So I see great things in store for you, for our nation, and hopefully for the world. And I feel some of the colleagues here aren't accepting the fact that we're $20 trillion in debt and that austerity measures are coming. You know, we've got reports of where we're going to be in 5 to 6 years, and we're looking at Puerto Rico, we're looking at, you know, Greece, and we don't want to go there. And so we do have to reform some of these programs, and that leads to the current budget, that we continue the programs that work and we get the results. We get the results that we're looking for and get rid of the programs that aren't working. We were in the DRC with Chairman Royce, and I remember sitting there at the table with the ministers, and we were going around and talking about things, and I asked the people at that table, and keep in mind we've given hundreds of billions of dollars, what do you do for your social programs? And they asked me, what do you mean? I said, well, feeding the hungry, housing, health care. And he goes, we have you. Those aren't good programs, and we need to reform those, and we need to put pressure on those kind of countries. You know, the comment that President Trump said, make America great again, put America first, I truly believe in that. And I think it's taken out of context, because the only way we can become great, or we can become first at whatever we do, is to look out for the partners that we're working with. And that comes through diplomacy in your agency. And I have a lot of confidence in your business acumen that you can transfer those to the State Department. I've watched you since you've come in, and I'm just a big fan of what you can do. And it's just, I know we're in separate branches of government. And look at this committee, or, you know, I chair the Asia Pacific Subcommittee, as we talked about, of how we can partner together to work on those commonalities. And with that, as you know, yesterday, Panama terminated the diplomatic relationships with Taiwan. And it's the latest China's effort to restrict Taiwan's international space, and including the blockade of Taiwan delegation at the World Health Assembly. And to me, this is unconscionable to say to another nation, and I feel like with other people that have said they are a nation that I recognize, and I know it's in a tough situation because we've had that policy since President Nixon, but saying that, and China says they're going to be a reliable partner to bring North Korea to the table. When we look at what China has done, they've increased their trade with North Korea 37.4% in the first quarter. Chinese imports of North Korean iron has increased 270% in January and February, yet no Chinese firms have been subjected to U.S. secondary sanctions. And I've heard you talk about that, and it looks like we're moving in that direction, and I commend you for that. China, can we realistically rely on China in lieu of their past experience or actions?
Well, first, just to remind you that our North Korea policy really went into effect late February, early March, when we began to execute that. And so we recognize there was a lot of activity going on early in the year and through the first quarter, and that's what we've been trying to attack. We recognize what China is doing to put pressure on smaller countries. They're using the power of their trading relations. They're using the power of aid that they have gone in and provided to smaller countries. And in my trip that I recently made down to Australia, New Zealand, in my meetings I've had with members of ASEAN, we're hearing this directly from them, that they're not only feeling this pressure, it is being put in there right in front of them to say, you either sever relations with thus and so, or we're going to end our trading relationships with you. Even large countries are being threatened in this way. In our conversations with the Chinese about this next 50 years of stability and prosperity, we are being clear to them that you are destabilizing what has been a stable relationship with these actions. If this is where you're going to create instability, and you're going to take this balance that has maintained a period of non-conflict, you're going to upset that balance.
Right.
So these are the kind of high-level discussions we're having with the most senior levels of the Chinese leadership. You have to think about, where does this go? Where does this lead? And what are you going to force as a response to that? So we are very mindful of it. We see it happening, and we see it as threatening stability in the region.
I agree, and I'm out of time. And my last just statement is, I hope we stay in honor of the Taiwan Relations Act as we have in the past. And Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Yoho. As I mentioned before, this hearing will conclude at 1:30. The Secretary has been very flexible, and he does have other commitments. So if the members will be brief and not compelled to use their full time, we want to give everyone a chance in the next 20 minutes. And we'll go to Robin Kelly of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Secretary, for coming to the House Foreign Affairs Committee. You're actually the first government witness, I believe, to appear before the full committee, so I thank you for that. The official mission statement of the State Department reads, the Department's mission is to shape and sustain a peaceful, prosperous, just, and democratic world and foster conditions for stability and progress for the benefit of the American people and people everywhere. In your testimony, you stated that the State Department's primary focus is to protect our citizens at home and abroad. And to me, that sounds more like the mission of the Defense Department than the State Department. So has the mission of the U.S. State Department changed somewhat under President Trump?
The mission statement that you just read is one that is very powerful and that I would certainly support. Having said that, it was a statement developed under previous administrations. Part of this redesign opportunity we have in front of us, a lot of the elements that we learned out of the listening session was there is some confusion over the mission. And that confusion doesn't just exist as of today, it's existed for some time. I think we do owe it to ourselves, with the input and help of our colleagues in the State Department, to do a better job of articulating what is the enduring mission of the State Department that endures regardless of what political party may be in place at any given time, because the State Department is here constant. We understand that the will of the American people changes and can change from one election to the next, but the State Department must have a mission that delivers regardless of what the policy decisions may be that change from time to time. And I think that's a conversation we really need to have with ourselves inside the State Department, with our colleagues, and that's the mission statement that I'm in search of, is what will endure regardless of who may be occupying the White House.
Thank you. I do agree with what most of my colleagues said about the budget cuts. I have a lot of concerns. And a recent article by Mike Mullen and James Jones, two distinguished military leaders, specifically cited cuts to USAID as risking U.S. national security. And they go on to specifically say that in the 21st century, weapons and war fighters alone are insufficient to keep America safe. Mr. Chairman, I ask to submit the entire article into the record. I also have
Without objection.
concerns about the staffing up that needs to be done, because that'll help you do the job you need to do if you have the people you need to have. Is there a backlog of policy recommendations now because of the lack of staffing?
There really is not. And again, I want to recognize, every job is filled today. either a deputy assistant stepped up to be the acting assistant, an acting assistant has stepped up to be the under if necessary. And these are remarkably good people, competent, dedicated. It is, and I have a lot of conversation with them about how I know it's difficult to be the acting, but they are doing a superb job. I have great confidence in them. They travel with me when I go overseas. These are the people that help me develop the policy. They are executing the policy, and they're doing an extraordinary job.
Okay. Because of time, I'll yield back.
For yielding back. We go to Brian Master, Florida.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for your time today. Just a couple quick questions. You have any plans to bring Vladimir Putin a red reset button?
I don't think you can reset anything. We are where we are. We just have to address the conditions as they exist.
You foresee turning a blind eye if Russia were to invade any other sovereignty?
Certainly not.
You anticipate President Trump whispering in the ear of the Russian president, saying he'd have more flexibility after the next election?
I would not expect that President Trump has any intent to do anything other than to try to restore this relationship to something that is in the interest of the American people.
You anticipate mocking the threat of the Russian influence on the United States by saying the 1980s want their foreign policy back?
I think we will be articulating our own view towards Russia, which I have described in some respects today. We take the relationship with Russia as serious. They are a global nuclear power. Having said that, we have a number of troubling issues with them in front of us to deal with.
You think there's any level of funding that can make up for actions like that?
I think this is going to be just very hard work of diplomacy, coupled with some strong actions that have been taken already, and the prospect of what the Congress can enable us to do with stronger actions if we cannot get progress.
Perfect. You believe that it's more important the words and the actions that you undertake than any level of funding that you try to meet?
Well, today in restoring that relationship, it is not an absence of funds that is in any way preventing us from continuing the work to identify areas where we may find cooperation to begin to build some level of trust and confidence. Funding is not an issue in terms of how we're working with Russia today.
Thank you for your remarks. I yield back.
We go now to Dina Titus of Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary. I, too, share my colleagues' concerns about the devastating budget cuts and also by the lack of senior leadership at the State Department. I don't see how we can move forward in a leadership role in the world with those two things, those two problems kind of hanging over us. But I want to go back to the kind of the questions that Mr. Castro raised. I don't believe our country has a singular voice when it comes to foreign policy, and that concerns our allies, and it also emboldens our adversaries because nobody knows who to believe. Now, he mentioned several examples, Qatar, the incident that occurred recently, the peace talks in the Middle East, but I'd like to bring up a couple of others. You weren't part of the discussion to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, and I believe you have said that you are opposed to that we should not have done that. I'd like to ask you why you think this was a bad idea, and is there any way with all this limited funds that we can move forward in any way as a leader on climate change? The second one I'd like to ask you to address is in the written statement, you say the U.S., and I'll quote, will continue to be the leader in international development, global health, democracy and good governance initiatives, and humanitarian efforts. Yet the President has said that we don't really care about what other countries are doing internally, only how they relate to us. It's not up to us to interfere. I believe the quote was, we're not here to tell other people how to live, what to do, and who to be. Would you tell us how that kind of jives with what you've said?
With respect to the decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, I was part of that interagency process. What I would point out to you, this is a decision the President could easily have taken the first week after inauguration. He clearly indicated in his campaign he intended to. I think it's noteworthy that he took some time to think about it. He deliberated on it. He heard a lot. We had a couple of different sessions on it with him. He waited until he took his first overseas trip and attended the G7 so he could hear directly from others that the issue is quite important to. And then he came home. He had one more deliberation. It was on a telephone conference call, which I participated. I was free to express my views. I took a counter view to the decision that was made, but I fully appreciate the elements behind why he took the decision.
Can you tell us why you have a counter position, why you don't think it was a good idea to pull out?
As I've expressed publicly and I expressed to the President, I think having our seat at the table around the Paris Climate Accord to continue to have influence on the issue itself, continue to represent America's efforts, because America has done an extraordinary job of dealing with our own greenhouse gas emissions without heavy-handed regulation. And just because we have walked away from targets that were set under Paris is in no way indicative of our intent to walk away from that continued improvement. I think Americans, businesses, and private and public enterprises have no intent of changing that commitment. So my view was, as a diplomat, it's an opportunity for engagement, and I take every opportunity for engagement I can. This is an issue that is very important to many of our allies. It is among their—
I agree. And
so I think having the opportunity to engage, that's the reason I argued for staying in.
Yeah, and how about the second point about just okay with whatever you do in your own country?
I think what the President was indicating is he is not into government building or changing governments. I think what he's indicating is some of them, in his view, mistakes have been made in the past by involving ourselves with countries and then expanding our involvement to want to now change their culture, change their heritage, change who they are, change the way they live their lives. And I think what he was saying is there's a lot of conflict that can be created when we try to go too far in imposing our way of life on others, that we have to recognize and respect the history of countries, the history of regions, their culture, and not create new areas of conflict just because we think they should be doing things differently. I think that's the intent. And I think there's a lot of merit in that, and I think there's a lot of, when I reflect on the conflicts around the world and how did we get there and why do they exist, a lot of it is grounded in these areas. We continue to believe that if we can deconflict areas, bring peace to areas, we have a much better chance of engaging on many things like human rights, freedom, democracy, which we want to, we will
I think my time is up.
promote.
I appreciate that. So after we go in and after the war is over, we don't have any responsibility for doing any nation building, but that's okay. I have to have my time.
Francis Rooney of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service. Thank you for leaving private industry to serve your country. As a person who's been in and out of the State Department for many years and has had commercial relationships with the Agency for International Development, I want to thank you for bringing a business-like and pro-taxpayer approach to funding the department. What you said is true. It's about what you can accomplish and what kind of people you have, not necessarily what you spend to get there. For example, like the record reflect, the department has spent over $29 million to subsidize an organization you and I know personally, the World Economic Forum. I wonder what the taxpayers would think of that. I want to applaud you in your budget for scrapping the disaster known as the U.S. Institute of Peace. If every taxpayer out from Florida to California could see that building, we'd have a revolt on our hands. And lastly, I wish you'd reconsider the $10 million you've got in there for the UN Human Rights Council. That's on top of $17.5 million that we've spent in the last few years to try to buy friendship with Israel that, I'll tell you, I bet you a steak dinner it's not going to work. And so I guess I just want to know, what can we do who agree with you to have your back, to encourage you to stay tough and to reinforce your effort to bring reform, to eliminate wasteful spending, and position the department to live effectively in the 21st century?
Well, Congressman, first, thank you for the support we already receive from the Congress and the input, which is really important for us to have an understanding of what the priorities are in the minds of the Congress, and in particular the House, because you represent, you're closest to the face of the American people, and I recognize that. I think in terms of some of these cuts to international organizations, we are looking at those one by one and really asking ourselves what is the cost benefit here. And in some areas, we either are going to reform those or we are going to withdraw from them. And we actually are using this exercise, and everyone is well aware of what we're going through here, where we are taking a very close look as what do we, the American people, get in return for this investment or this funding that we provide. And that is very much not as a threat, but as a tool to use so they understand this time this is a serious conversation. We need to get to a serious conclusion. If you don't want to change, if you don't want to reform, that's fine. Just let us know, and we'll try a different approach. And the Human Rights Council at the UN is one that we're currently engaged in. Ambassador Haley is directly engaged in. She and I have spoken about we're either going to reform this thing and make it reflect what it should be reflecting, or we're going to withdraw our support for it and try to find other means that we can approach human rights issues on a multilateral basis with partners who see it the same way we do.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield my time.
Thank you. Norma Torres from California will be our last speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Secretary, and thank you for staying as long as you have and accommodating our tough day today. I understand that later this week you are traveling to Miami for a conference about security and prosperity in Central America, specifically the Northern Triangle area. I want to make you aware that we in Congress have been working very hard on a bipartisan way to deal with the crisis we have in this area. And I want to make sure that you understand that while our president may not think that we should be building up other governments, our national security is very dependent on the democracy and democracy issues within our neighbors, our closest neighbors to the south. We have to be very proactive at dealing with the very corrupt governments that have become a culture of these of our neighbors. We have to deal with the narco traffic issues and the money laundering that happens in this region because they are our partners in our national security. So thank you for making a commitment to working there. But I also want to make sure that you understand that this is important to Congress, and we passed this resolution unanimously here in Congress. The world looks at the United States for leadership on the global stage. Unfortunately, the president's words and actions have been undermining American leadership. Part of the problem is that we don't have a fully staffed, functioning State Department. Another problem is that there is a conflict of mixed messages that come across when the president tweets and you have a different response and his press team has a different response. Mr. Secretary, my question to you is, are the president's tweets the official foreign policy of the United States?
I'm not going to comment extensively on the president's tweets. The president has his own means that he wishes to communicate, and he communicates a lot of different messages.
I understand that, sir, but either it is an informed decision based on facts that he is tweeting out, and is this our policy, U.S. policy?
I'm not involved in how the president constructs his tweets, when he tweets, why he tweets, what he tweets.
It seems to be a game that goes back and forth. This is not meant to be, a gotcha question. This is simply wanting to clarify for other world leaders. I was just on a trip to Mexico with a delegation of U.S. members of Congress. And part of, the insecurity with our closest neighbor to the south is the fact that the president puts out tweets and people don't know. These leaders don't know if this is informed policy and if this is truly how the United States intends to conduct business.
Well, what I would say with our neighbors in Mexico to the south, and you mentioned the Miami conference that I'll be going to tomorrow to address both economic and security issues in the Triangle area. This conference is being co-sponsored by the State Department, Department of Homeland Security, our Mexican counterparts, the Foreign Ministry, and the State Minister of Mexico. This is something that came out of our Mexico City engagement because we recognize we have a common issue in transmigration that is a problem for Mexico, a problem for us. And what we're doing is, and this kind of gets to our approach to the budget question and concerns that we're not going to be able to carry out our foreign policy objectives. These are some of the innovative approaches we're taking, where we're bringing the Inter-American Bank, the World Bank, we're bringing a number of private sector entities to Miami. The Vice President is coming to give the keynote address at the lunch, so I think this
You know who's not
indicates,
coming?
I guess.
Do you know who's not coming? And it's not because you did not invite them, but the attorneys general of all three countries are not coming simply because their governments think that there is instability happening here in the U.S. and they have left them out. And I think it's important at this conference, sir, that we call them out on that.
Well, as you know, a lot of our assistance in those three countries is to strengthen law enforcement, strengthen the ability of attorney generals to prosecute, strengthen the courts to make those cases stick on corruption in particular. We have made progress, and the reason we're focusing on the triangle area is because we've made progress. We think we are very close to pushing this over the hump, so to speak, and we want to bring in a lot of others to help with this so that we're not doing it alone.
Well, I want to thank the Secretary for his time with the committee. This has been a challenging day in Congress.
Well, Mr. Chairman,
It's a tough world out there. Excuse me, we're at 1:30, and
I just
I
want to
gave
make
my
the
commitment
I want to make
that
the
we
request, and
would
I
adjourn.
appreciate that, and thank the Secretary for speaking here today and sharing your time so generously. On behalf of those of us who were not able to ask questions, I request that we may submit them to you and get a response in writing.
I look
Absolutely.
forward to any other questions. I know I'm sorry we were unable to have a dialogue with each of you as well. And again, I understand the circumstances entirely.
And as I said at the beginning of the hearing, that absolutely is something we will do. And I do want to convey on behalf of all the members here, the committee looks forward to working with you, Mr. Secretary, on many policies, including your reorganization efforts. And you've heard our concerns, and we look forward to receiving your legislative proposals for the department's reorganization once they're ready. Again, I thank you, and I thank you for being prepared to respond to the other members who did not get an opportunity here today. I thank you, and we stand adjourned.